Hello and welcome. This is Trumpetman, and you're listening to the 40 Card College podcast or the Rare Mythic Review live here on Twitch / going to be our YouTube, all that good stuff. So today on the podcast, it's going to be pretty straightforward. We're going to be doing all the rares and mythics from Phyrexia. All will be one, so that is the plan. Of course, before we jump into things, a quick word on the Patreon. So to keep it short and sweet, since we're getting to these cards right away, I do want to give a shout out to all the patrons that are supporting the project. Also, a special shout out to Marius and Adrian, our Add Up Tier and Above patrons. If you feel like the show has given you insight into Phyrexia would be one with all the commons and uncommons, or just in the past with level ups, all that kind of stuff, everything on the website, then you can always check out all the perks over at patreon.com/40cardcollege. All right, with that, we're going to jump straight in today to reviewing our rares and mythics. Before we do, just a quick word on the grading scale. So we're using the A through F patented grading scale here. So A is your game winners like Titania's Command. B, your pulls into colors like Horned Stoneseeker. C's is your bread and butter limited card. They're going to provide a lot of utility to your deck overall. A lot of commons sit at the C level. So that's like Warlord's Elite. D are your cards that not too happy if they make your deck, but you technically can play them. So cards like Takasia's Onulet. And then your Fs, you never want to put them in your deck. Cards like Ivory Tower, where when you play it, kind of just a mulligan, didn't do anything, is just terrible. Then we also have build around grades. So I'm going to mark those as stars on the grading scale here. For those listening to the podcast version of this, there will be links in the show notes for the presentation. So if you want to go through and see all of the grades for all the commons, uncommons, mythics, and rares, it'll all be in the same spot. And then for those watching live or on YouTube, there will be obviously the visuals. So you'll be able to see that as I input the grades. So star for build around grade, and then also we have a double star for a sideboard grade. I don't believe I gave out any sideboard grades earlier, or maybe I just like one, but they're pretty uncommon where like you only really want to pull the card out of the sideboard to play things like Broken Wings or fringe counter spells, or sometimes you can board them in, but in general most things are not going to get a sideboard grade. So today, because we're doing rares and mythics, we're going to see a lot more A's, that kind of thing, and for like the weird wacko cards, probably a few more F's like that, whereas tends to be with the commons and uncommons, you tend to see a lot more of those bread and butter C's, and then some B's and D's as well. So we're going to be more on the extremes today. With that, we're going to jump right in where we left off last time. So here our very first mythic, which is fitting for this set, right? It is Phyrexia will be one. We're starting things off with Elish Norn, Mother of Machines. So this is kind of the headliner card. Costs 4 and a white for a 4/7 Phyrexian Praetor that's mythic. It has Vigilance, and if a permanent entering the battlefield causes a triggered ability of a permanent you control to trigger, that ability triggers an additional time. And also, because it's these Praetors, it turns off that for your opponent. So permanents entering the battlefield don't cause abilities of permanents your opponents control to trigger. So it's going to double all of your enter the battlefields, and then it's going to turn that off for all your opponent's stuff. This is kind of like a commandery card, but in terms of limited, how good is this card? Well, a 4/7 Vigilance for 4 and a white is definitely in the B range already, because it's just huge, blocks really well, and sometimes attacks really well if your opponent can't like double triple block it. 7 toughness, makes it brawl really, really well. So already that's kind of in the B range. And then how good is it to double your ETBs and stop your opponent? That's definitely very, very powerful. I would say like if you're building around this card, you can get it kind of all the way up to maybe like an A. But in general, I think this card's going to be kind of like an A minus, where the 4/7 Vigilance, it's kind of doing its thing. And then you get some little bonuses. But then also, turning off your opponent's abilities of them entering the battlefield is pretty huge, especially if anything comes in and like kills something. Also, it says permanents. So I know there's the claustrophobia card that costs 1 blue, the common. So it comes in and taps something down, but that's a triggered ability. So if your opponent has that card, they can't tap anything down. It would already have to be tapped. So I mean, Elish Norn's just going to do a lot of different things. And while it doesn't like kill anything on the board, it does enough things really, really well to I think give it that A- grade. So that's what we're gonna go with on the mother here. Next up, we have the Eternal Wanderer. This is our first Planeswalker we're going to talk about today. Now, there are 10 Planeswalkers we're going to discuss, 5 at Rare and 5 at Mythic. So all the kind of quote-unquote good guy Planeswalkers that aren't completed are Rare, and all the completed Planeswalkers are Mythic. So we're going to see that here. Okay, so Eternal Wanderer is 4 white for a 5 loyalty Planeswalker at Rare. And it has the static ability, no more than one creature can attack the Eternal Wanderer each combat. So straight up, your opponent has a 3/3 and a 4/4, well, they can only attack you with that 4/4. So that's already pretty good. Then it has +1 loyalty, exile up to one target artifact or creature, return that card to the battlefield under its owner's control at the beginning of that player's next instep. 0, create a 2/2 white samurai creature token with double strike, and -4 for each player, choose a creature that player controls. Each player sacrifices all creatures they control not chosen this way. So this card is bananas. Like, it protects itself on the static ability alone. We're talking about that. Comes in with 5 loyalty, can tick up to 6 immediately. So unless your opponent can attack it for 6 damage with one creature, it's sitting pretty nice. The tick up allows you to, like, let's say your opponent does have a 6/6 as their only creature. Well, you can just remove that from play entirely with the +1. If the board is stable, you can start making 2/2 double strikes, which will change the game pretty quickly. You can also blink your own things with the +1. And then lastly, it comes in with 5 loyalty. And then for each player, choose a creature that players controls. So you get the choice, right? You give your opponent a toxic might that they can't block with, and then you get to keep, whatever your biggest thing is. So we've seen some bombs before, but at Rare, this card is kind of the bombiest of the bombs. I'm going A+ on this card. Like, other than it costing 6 mana, I can't imagine very many games where the person casting the Eternal Wanderer loses after doing so. The player that is ahead has to be really, really, really far ahead. And if they don't have like a removal spell that hits a Planeswalker, this is just gonna completely warp the game. So Eternal Wanderer, A+, incredible card. Next up, we have Kemba, Caught Enduring. This is 1 and a white for a 2/2 cat cleric, a legendary cat cleric at Rare. It says whenever Kemba, Caught Enduring, or another cat enters the battlefield under your control, attach up to one target equipment you control to that creature. Equipped creatures get +1/+1. Equipped creatures you control get +1/+1. And 3 white to create a 2/2 white cat creature token. So it triggers itself to allow you to move an equipment around. Attach up to one target equipment to that creature. Okay, so when it comes in, it can pick up an equipment. That's already kind of nice. Notably, you can't move it to whatever you want, but the cat that's coming in has to get it. And it makes cats on its own. So, like, you can also move the equipment to the cats that you make, right? And the equipped creatures you control get +1/+1. So if we think about this, and it counts itself, when this comes in as a 2/2, let's say you have like a +2/+0 equipment lying around, then you equip it to Kemba. It pumps itself with the +1/+1. So you're getting like a 2 mana 5/3 with just like a +2/+0 equipment lying around. And to protect Kemba, you could even make cats that can then wear the equipment, and just keep making them. So this card is pretty great. Now, let's look at it with the equipment running. This card's like probably like an A-. It's expensive in terms of making the cats, but it runs away with the game pretty quickly. So if you have an equipment in play and you're churning out cats and you're doing that, this card probably is like an A-. If this is just a 2 mana 2/2 and then you can pay 5 to make a cat and you're not very equipment heavy, that card's probably like a B- to B. Probably closer to B-, honestly. Like, these days you can't just spend 5 mana making a 2/2 and like that have that be your whole game plan. Tends to be that you need to do more with your mana. So if it's like an A- when it's churning on all cylinders, and it's like a B- when it's just kind of doing its own thing, Where's the card? Probably around like a B plus overall. Like the card is quite good, but you really make sure you do have some of the equipment payoffs with Kemba, because it performs like a completely different card when you're giving things +1/+1. It's definitely more of like a build around. Next up, we have Mondrock, Glory Dominus. This is 2 white white for a 4/4 legendary Phyrexian horror at Mythic. It says if one or more tokens would be created under your control, twice that many tokens are created instead. And then it has one Phyrexian white, sacrifice 2 other artifacts and or creatures, put an indestructible counter on Mondrock Glory Dominus. So we are going to see Phyrexian mana on a lot of Mythics today between this cycle and also the completed Planeswalker cycle. So a reminder that Phyrexian mana can be paid with either white mana or 2 life in this case. Phyrexian mana, just the color that it is, or 2 life. So basically, you're getting a 4 mana 4/4, and then if you just happen to have a single mana lying around on top of that, and you have 2 other creatures in play, your opponent kind of can't kill this, because if they threaten to kill it, you can just sack 2 other things immediately, and then it gets an indestructible counter, and then you just have a 4/4 indestructible sitting around, which is obviously incredible. And white is the color that makes a bunch of mites, right? So if you have this and you're able to make a mite, then it makes 2 mites, and then almost immediately, then you have the indestructible counter off of Mondrock. So this card's pretty insane. If you're not going wide, the card's a little bit weaker, but as soon as you get the indestructible counter, the card basically can't be dealt with. Now, I will say that a decent amount of the common removal actually does stop indestructible horrors, because you have, tapping effects, you have like basically all the enchantment based removal can deal with it, and then in black you have some exile as well. Blue has some bounce. So, I mean, it's not that the card is completely unbeatable, but a 4/4 indestructible obviously is pretty good. It requires a pretty narrow range of answers. So, at the end of the day, I mean, this card is probably just an A. This whole cycle is going to be pretty insane, because any time that you can spend pretty little investment, honestly, to make something indestructible is going to be amazing. And then if you're pairing this with, like, the tokens, then obviously it gets even better. Without tokens, this card's probably more like a B plus, A minus, but it's really good. Next up, we have Norn's Wellspring, which is 1 and a white for a rare artifact. It says whenever a creature you control dies, scry 1 and put an oil counter on Norn's Wellspring. You can also pay 1, tap it, remove 2 oil counters from Norn's Wellspring to draw a card. So pretty straightforward. It kind of builds up those counters over time. If your creatures die, then you're gonna get to see actually what you want to, which is nice, because you scry 1 and put the oil counters on it, and then you get to draw off removing the oil counters. So like late game, if you're not interested in lands anymore, you scry all the lands to the bottom, and hopefully you draw into action with the draw ability. In addition, having oil counters, if you're able to play that in a space that actually can proliferate it, like with pairing this with another color, because white's not really about the proliferate, then that's going to be pretty nice, right? Like I can imagine in like a white red deck where you have a lot of oil from the red cards, then if that paired with some proliferate, you might actually be able to do something kind of neat with this card. Whereas most of the time you're not really going to be doing that, but even if you just play this and 2 things die, then it's going to replace itself right away and you get the 2 scries. I don't think the card's like incredible, because it does take a little bit of work to get your first draw. And after that, you kind of want to get until like 4 creatures that you have controlled died to get the double draw off of it. But the fact that you get scry 1 every single time is a big game changer. I think this card would be kind of bad if it was just like when something dies, you get the oil counter, and then you had to draw. Like the fact that you can really change what you want is kind of nice. The only problem is that it is a little bit reminiscent of the artifact Weatherlight completed, that kind of thing from DMU, which was that legendary artifact that kind of sat around, and every time something died, then you'd get to scry 1 and eventually start drawing cards. But the thing about the Norn's Wellspring, as opposed to the Weatherlight completed, that was kind of a ticking time bomb to grow into a creature, and your opponent could like find removal for it. Whereas when this card starts to work, um, you're drawing cards, and it's harder for your opponent to stop that plan. So I think at least like this is better than that card because it's all in on. I just want to advance my plan of like trading off creatures and turning that into future resources. In addition, if you do have some proliferate stuff, it's a lot easier to get advantage off Norn's Wellspring than it was off of Weatherlight Completed. All that said, how good is this card? Um, Probably somewhere between like a C plus or B minus. You really have to make sure that you're building a deck that can take advantage of it. In a deck that's just like a random white deck, it's probably much more like a C plus. But if you happen to have a lot of like tokens and mites and things your opponent's going to want to block anyways, because notably it doesn't say non-token, then it's going to function more like a B plus, B minus. I'm going to put a B minus kind of build around. Like you do need like cheap go wide things, or you need a lot of proliferate to kind of generate more oil. But the card can be pretty powerful. Next up, we have Phyrexian Vindicator. This card is crazy. It costs white, 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 white. 4 white mana symbols. So you better be getting something pretty insane for this card. Now, it is a Phyrexian Horror at Mythic. So we're thinking, hey, this is going to be pretty good. And it's a 5/5 flyer. So this card is actually a play on the Phyrexian Obliterator, but it's the white version. And so it's a 4 mana 5/5 flyer. And it says, if damage would be dealt to Phyrexian Vindicator, prevent that damage. When damage is prevented this way, Phyrexian Vindicator deals that much damage to any other target. Wow. So yeah, you're getting paid off for this card. If your opponent can't kill this with like just creature removal, even if it's like damage based removal, then they basically can't win, right? If your opponent has, they're playing red, I don't know, whatever, red blue, and all they have is bounce and creature burn. They can maybe bounce this a couple times, but you can block every single time. It redirects the damage to something else, and then it attacks incredibly well too. Because if your opponent blocks this card, then you just get to shoot something down as well. Um, so obviously the card is incredible. It's like A plus power level, but it costs white, 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 white. So you would have to have like at least 13, 14, 15 white sources in your deck to reliably cast this card. So that's going to be pretty hard to do. Basically, you want to think of it like either you're mono white or bust, or you're playing white splash a color, where it's like you're mono white splashing a few blue cards. Okay. Then you could maybe get away with the white, 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 white mana cost. But the card doesn't do anything if it doesn't come out early enough. And because your opponent can go around it if you're at a low life total, it's actually pretty important you get this down for the like this card on like between turns 4 to 6, let's say. So you really want to build your mana base to make this card actually work. Otherwise, it's not really great. Like if you have an even split mana base and you play this card on like turn 10, 11, 12, well, you had to survive that whole time, and then maybe you're at like 2 or 3 life, and it didn't even matter that it came down. So you don't want to just put this into a normal deck. But if let's say you have a deck that has, I don't know, 14 or 15 white mana symbols or white mana sources at least, then I mean this card is just an A. So I'm just gonna give it an A. I mean the card is great, but I am gonna put a build around because you can't just put this in a normal deck. The build around is just the mana base. So if you can cast it, it's an A. If you can't cast it, then it's bad, right? So that makes sense. So wow, Phyrexian Vindicator, they're kind of coming out swinging here with these rares and mythics. Next up, we have Skrelv Defector Mite. It's a single white mana for a 1/1 legendary artifact Phyrexian Mite at rare. It has Toxic 1 and can't block. So it's basically a Mite, but it's a legendary Mite. So what else do you get? Well, you can pay a Phyrexian white and tap it to choose a color. Another target creature you control gains Toxic 1 and Hexproof from that color until end of turn. It can't be blocked by creatures of that color this turn. So it kind of does this kind of like Mother of Runes type effect, but also makes your creature like not able to block or not be blocked. So it kind of also gives its Toxic 1 to another creature, which is kind of cool. So the problem with some of these mites in general is that eventually they're just going to be blocked and they're going to die. So that just doesn't do very much for you, right? However, the trick here with Skrelv is that yeah, you play this on turn, 1. You get in for 1 or 2 damage, hopefully, and so your opponent gets a couple poison counters. And then it's going to be bricked because your opponent played a 2/2, and you're like, well, my Skrelv can't do anything now. However, suddenly, your next creature, you can just use Skrelv to start punching it through with the activation on Skrelv. And you can even, early in the game, use the Phyrexia mana, so you're paying life if it's favorable for you to get your creature through and start toxicking your opponent. And then later, you can just start paying regular white mana for it as well. Now, notably, it only hits another target creature. So with its ability, so there's not usually a reason to try to hold Skrelv up to like protect itself. That doesn't work. But you do have to kind of decide, like, do I want to use this aggressively to punch a creature through my opponent's board, or do I want to hold up Skrelv to protect a creature? The thing is, early on, Skrelv already is doing so much, your opponent's usually just going to kill Skrelv. So if you're inclined to use it aggressively and that's going to be good for you, then I think that's fine to do, because a lot of times you're not going to want to hold it up to quote unquote protect something else. However, you get to turn like, 5, 6, 7, you play a giant bomb other than Skrelv or some giant creature. Well, you can actually just hold Skrelv up too, and now your opponent has to deal with it first before they can even hit that other creature. So you kind of, there's this fun mini game later on where you want to like kind of decide like, how valuable is it to keep attacking at this point in the game versus protect my big threat? And so Skrelv's uses kind of change over the course of the game. I think it's really quite a good card. Probably, I think it's going to perform like at a B plus level, because anytime you play this on turn 1, it's just going to be excellent, and it's going to be useful the whole game. Like if you draw this card on turn 7, it's going to help you attack with creatures that wouldn't be able to attack otherwise, and it's going to add Toxic 1 to them. So like if you were trying to be aggressive, then it's going to be really, really good. So as long as you're aggressive, I think this card is going to be like a B plus. Now, in some random deck that doesn't care about Toxic, then this card's not going to be good. It's going to be like, C, C plus. But as long as you're aggressive, you hear about Toxic, I think Skrelv is excellent. So B plus for Skrelv, really cool card. Next, we have Skrelv's Hive. This is where Skrelv hangs out, gets off work, and that's where it goes. So it's 1 and a white for a rare enchantment, and it says at the beginning of your upkeep, you lose 1 life and create a 1/1 colorless Phyrexian Might artifact creature token with Toxic 1, and this creature can't block. So every single turn, you lose a life and you get a Might. It also has Corrupted. As long as an opponent has 3 or more poison counters, creatures you control with Toxic have lifelink. So not just Mites have lifelink, but all your creatures with Toxic have lifelink. That's really going to be nice for when you're racing. So Skrelv's Hive, yeah, it hurts you a little bit early on, but let's say you play this on turn 2 and you haven't played anything else. Turn 3, you get a Might. Let's say you played a 3-drop. Turn 4, you get a Might. You've lost life at this point. Maybe your opponent has a blocker, so you can't attack. Turn 5, you get a Might. Now you have 3 of them. But your opponent's kind of having to start to hold things back, because now you have these Mights, and if they attack you to try to race you, because you're losing life every single turn. After all, you're at 17 from Skrelv's Hive immediately. If they attack you, well, you just get to crack back with 3 Mights and whatever else you played, and your opponent suddenly is going to be corrupted. So now all your Mights are going to have Toxic as well. So even if they hit you down to like 14, 13 life, now all your Mights have lifelink, and you're going to get back that life very, very quickly. So if you ever play Skrelv's Hive on turn 2, it's going to be really, really good. And what's going to happen is if you draw this like in the middle game where it's not quite as good, at least at that point, likely your opponent's corrupted. And so at that point, all your creatures with Toxic are going to have lifelink. Now, not every single creature is going to have Toxic, but a lot of them do. Like, white is really Toxic-centric. So, assuming that, and the fact that it also pumps out its own Toxic creature tokens, means this does eventually just win the game on its own. And it's, for that reason, like, it's more annoying than, like, bomby, but it's really, really good at the same time. I'm going to give this card a B. I think eventually it just can't be ignored, and that fact that your opponent also can't race it because of the lifelink, like, and it solves its own problem with the life loss, means Skrelv's Hive is going to be pretty nice. So B for Skrelv's Hive, pretty cool card. And then next we have a White Sun's Twilight. So it's X white white for a rare sorcery. It says you gain X life and create X mites, and if X is 5 or more, destroy all other creatures. So you pay, let's say 6 mana, you get 4 mites. It's fine, not that exciting. But you pay 7 or more mana, suddenly you're getting 5 plus mites and blow everything else up. So, you know, this card is just the reset button. It's a play on, there was a card from way back in Conflux that basically did the same thing, but it made a bunch of soldier tokens. Now, the mites can't block, but once you blow up the board, that doesn't really matter. And if you've toxic your opponent at all, sometimes they might have like 4 or 5 poison already. So you play this, wipe the board. Your opponent might just be facing lethal after, and they need to stabilize really quickly. So this is like a wrath, but it's not really a wrath. It's like a pseudo plague wind because you lose your board too. But it helps you if you're already going wide, right? Because you can pay 6 mana and make 4 mites. If you're really far ahead, like sometimes you're going to do that, and then that's just going to help you win the game. And then any other time, if you happen to be behind at all, you just make a bunch of mites, and your opponent is in a world of hurt. So I mean, yeah, this card is just pretty incredible. I think it's somewhere in like the A minus A range. If anything, I think this is kind of like it is 7 mana to wipe the board, so I think I have to go A minus. Like you're not going to wipe the board and pull ahead no matter what, so it's a little expensive, but it's pretty good. This card's pretty backbreaking. So yeah, the white got some rares, didn't it? I think the lowest grade was like the lowest grade was the Norn's Wellspring, and even that had applications. So pretty impressed by the white cards. Okay, next up is blue. So we have Blade of Shared Souls. It's 2 and a blue for an artifact equipment at rare, and it has, get ready, get home, 4 Mirrodin, right? So it comes with that 2/2. It says whenever Blade of Shared Souls becomes attached to a creature, and that counts when it 4 Mirrodins as well. For as long as Blade of Shared Souls remains attached to it, you may have that creature become a copy of another target creature you control. And it has equip 2. So for 3 mana, you get a 2/2, and that 2/2 can copy the best creature you have, um, as long as it comes in. So it's not a great play on turn 3 because you just have a 2/2 probably, or maybe you can slightly upgrade it. But later in the game, if you have like a 4/4 lying around, this is another 3 mana 4/4, and let's see, the creature enters and then this attaches and becomes a copy. So the thing is, it doesn't work. Let's see. When this, I'm trying to see if it works with enter the battlefield. When this equipment enters the battlefield, create a 2/2 rebel creature token, then attach this to it. I'm not sure if it triggers enter the battlefield's effects. Maybe let me look this up really quick. Let's see. So how can I find this out? What do they call it? Notes. I'm not really sure. Oh, I think they call it release notes. If okay, Phyrexia all will be one release notes. Here we go. Cards. Let's see. All right. It doesn't even tell me. So I'm looking at the release notes. I think it doesn't trigger enter the battlefields because it enters, creates a 2/2, and then it attaches to it, so the 2/2 is already in play. Anyways, we'll kind of have to see that one plays out. So, assuming that you can't get enter the battlefield effects with Blade of Shared Souls, and it just copies stats basically, the card is not that exciting. It's probably like, I don't know, like a C plus because it's a 3 mana creature that's going to be a bit better, and sometimes you move it to make a small creature a bigger creature. So I'm not really too in on Blade of Shared Souls. I think it's fine because, well, maybe it's like a B minus. Because if you can turn this into like, let's say it comes in as like a Windrake or something and at least has flying, then eventually you could move and make like a 1/1 into. Nah, I don't know. This card, it can't be that bad because it comes with a body. But I'm not going too high on Blade of Shared Souls. All right, so B minus for that one. Next up, we have Blue Sun's Twilight. So this is the blue version. It costs X blue blue for a rare sorcery. It says gain control of target creature with mana value X or less. If X is 5 or more, create a token that's a copy of that creature. So you get to steal a creature, and early game, well, not early game, but like towards the middle of the game, if you spend 5 mana, you can steal like a 3 mana play. And basically that's a 2-for-1 because your opponent loses with something, you're up something. So that's already pretty nice, unless they can bounce it. And then later in the game, let's say your opponent's best thing is like a 4 mana 4/4. Well, you can actually spend 5 mana because X is 5, so you can spend 7 mana. And you can target that 4/4 and you also still get a copy of it because it only checks if it has mana X or less. So basically, you can just kind of overload your Blue Sun's Twilight. And the fact that you get a copy as well, basically steal the best thing, get a copy of it, that is pretty ridiculous. And this card's even good at like 4 or 5 mana. If you really need to, you steal your opponent's 2 or 3 drop, and that's fine. And then late in the game, it just wins on its own. Like if your opponent plays a 5/5 for 5, and you spend 7 mana and take that and make a copy, I don't know. Like this is on par with the White Sun's Twilight for sure. They're both pretty bananas. This one might even be a little better because um, in a game where you're just a little behind, like you can steal something and then stabilize early. Like you don't need to get to all the way to 7 mana. I think this card's just an A. Like that is incredible rate. It's like a control magic early and then better than that later on. And it's not even enchantment based. So like if your opponent happens to, they can't even like disenchant your steal effect, right? Sometimes that's the problem with these types of like control magics. But yeah, A for Blue Sun's Twilight. That is a beating. Next up, we have an Encroaching Mycosynth. Costs 3 and a blue for a rare artifact. It says, non-land permanents you control are artifacts in addition to their other types. The same is true for permanent spells you control and non-land permanent cards you own that aren't on the battlefield. So how good is it to turn all your things into artifacts, even your spells? I think there's a few things that care, like if artifacts enter or leave, but spending an entire card to like buff up those other cards is pretty bad. I could see a world where like maybe that exists. Um, I kind of just want to give this card an F, but maybe there's like some sort of build around where like this could be like a D. The problem is, even if this card is ever really, really good, you're kind of trying to build your deck around turning everything into artifacts and then caring about artifacts. So if you don't draw this card and then everything cares about artifacts and entering, but they're not artifacts before this, that's just this card's just an F. This is not what you want to be doing. It doesn't even work as a build around because if you don't draw it, your deck's non-functional. So I would say pass on the Encroaching Mycosynth. Let it encroach on constructed formats instead. Then we have Ickermoon Gauntlet. It's 2 and a blue for a mythic artifact. That's pretty cool. And it's looks like the gauntlet of the green blue planeswalker Kiora. And it says planeswalkers you control have 0. So they gain an ability. It says 0 proliferate and -12 loyalty. Take an extra turn after this one. It also has whenever you cast a non-creature spell, choose a counter on target permanent. Put an additional counter on that kind of that permanent. Okay, so the card's not completely blank for limited because it doesn't just care about planeswalkers. If it just cared about planeswalkers, it'd probably be an F. But it's basically we can ignore the planeswalker text. If you ever get that, cool. Like, good for you. That's impressive. But it says, so how good is a 2 and a blue artifact for saying whenever you cast a non-creature spell, choose a counter on target permanent and get an additional kind. So really it's just going to be oil counters. So anytime you cast a non-creature spell, then you get to proliferate onto a permanent. And usually that's going to be oil counters. But most of the oil counter permanents that really care about that already trigger off of like going up with non-creature spells. I don't think there's too many where like the oil counter is super, super valuable, but then it's hard to get them. where like the only way to get them is through proliferate. So it's kind of like when you cast a non-creature spell, you get a bad proliferate, but it'd be better to just, I think, replace this card with a proliferate ability, like just a card that proliferates, because you only get it on one thing, and it also doesn't tick up opponents' poison counters. So at the end of the day, if you want like a really bad proliferate engine, I think you could do worse than the Gauntlet, but I think in general it's going to be worse than just like the Anticipate that also proliferates. So for me, I'm going to give this card a D. Like, I think it's playable, but not one you're really interested in. Next, we have Jace the Perfected Mind. Okay, here we go. So 2 blue and a Phyrexian blue. So you can either pay 2 and a blue, or you can pay 2 blue. And so it's a Mythic Jace, and it has completed. So if you pay 2 and a blue and 2 life, it's a 3 loyalty Jace. If you pay 2 blue, it's a 5 loyalty Jace. And its abilities are +1 until your next turn, up to 1 target creature gets -3/-0. That kind of protects itself. That's nice. It has -2. Target player mills 3 cards. Then, if a graveyard has 20 or more cards in it, you draw 3 cards. Otherwise, you draw a card. And then it has -X. Target player mills 3 times X cards. So if you use the -2, someone mills, and then 20 or more cards in a graveyard, you get to draw 3. Otherwise, only drawing 1. So -2ing to immediately draw 1 is not a great ability because you don't also get to protect Jace that turn, and you're only drawing 1. But in a pinch, it's a way to pull ahead. But I think even better than that is protecting Jace with the +1 for a few turns. Especially, if, let's say you play it on the 2 blue mode. It comes in with 5 loyalty. If you tick it up, then it has 6 loyalty. And then it immediately mills for 18 cards, right? So that's already over half your opponent's library, and if they've ever drawn any cards, or the game's been going a little bit long, that might just win the game on the spot anyways. So in fact, for 2 blue at 5 loyalty, you can instantly -X, and if your opponent has 15 or fewer cards, you just instantly win. So that's a pretty nice floor for this Jace, and then on top of it, it just has all these other abilities. It probably only needs to tick up a few turns before presenting lethal with a -X. And there's been some other Jaces like that in the past where they kind of like tick up a couple times and just completely mill your opponent out. So it's like a 1 card mill engine all on its own in win condition. It can be attacked. Your opponent can go around it, and the -2 is a little unimpressive, but still pretty good. I don't think it's like the best Planeswalker in the set, but it's still, I think, like an A- because it is often going to win the game on its own, and so that's an A level card. It's like somewhere between A- and an A, a really good card. It doesn't actually like completely remove things from the board, so it kind of misses that A mark for me, I think, in limited. But if you open Jace, I mean, it's going to be the best card in almost every pack. Okay, next up we have Mercurial Spelldancer. 1 and a blue for a 2/1 Phyrexian Rogue at rare. This Mercurial Spelldancer can't be blocked, and whenever you cast a non-creature spell, put an oil counter on it. And then what do we do with oil? It says, whenever Mercurial Spelldancer deals combat damage to a player, you may remove 2 oil counters from it. If you do, when you cast your next instant or sorcery spell this turn, copy it. You may choose new targets for the copy. Pretty cool. So it's a threat all on its own, right? Because a 2 mana, 2/1 unblockable. How good is that? Already pretty decent card, right? That clocks your opponent a lot. And it helps trigger the combat threshold, right? Where when it deals damage to your opponent, then you get to remove the counters. And so what a common play pattern, you play this on like, turn 2 ideally, but it gets in for, 4 damage or something. By then, maybe you've cast your couple non-creature spells. You get the oil counters on it. Then you attack. It triggers, right? So you remove the 2 oil counters from it. And then it copies your next instant or sorcery. Hopefully it's a removal spell. So, while you're attacking your opponent and kind of sitting around dirtling, doing nothing, your opponent is meanwhile playing like their 3 and 4 drops. Then on your turn, like turn 5, you can remove the oil counters and then kill both their creatures, and suddenly you've attacked them for like 6 damage and the board is stabilized again. So that's pretty strong. And even as just 2/1 unblockable without the other abilities, this is super good. So I think you do want to put this in kind of that like blue-red attack strategy. But as long as you're interested in damaging your opponent and not just like toxicing your opponent, then I think you're going to be happy with this card. And then if you ever get to copy some spells on top of it, it's going to be just incredible. So how good is that? I think it's like a B plus. Like, I don't know, they're really pushing these rares. A 2 mana 2/1 unblockable is an amazing floor. So yeah, I'm in for Mercurial Spelldancer. That's going to be very, very strong. Mind Splice Apparatus is 3 and a blue for a rare artifact. It has flash, and at the beginning of your upkeep, put an oil counter on it. And then it says instant and sorcery spells you cast cost 1 less to cast for each oil counter on Mind Splice Apparatus. Hey, finally a card that doesn't just completely roll over your opponent instantly on rate. So for 4 mana, it does nothing immediately. Then on your next turn, it gets an oil counter. And all your instants and sorceries cost 1 less. That's a nice bonus. Eventually, maybe they cost 2 less. It'll let you like double spell. But you have to invest 4 mana in a card to maybe let you eventually like double or triple spell. Not really a card I'm interested in. You'd have to have so many instants and sorceries to make this good. And then at that point, you're kind of playing just a bad card to make your good cards better. Like if you already have a deck with a ton of instants and sorceries and a ton of payoffs for that, then you really don't need the Mind Splice Apparatus. Your deck's already kind of smooth sailing. I could see this in a world where you wanted to play this in like a constructed format and, you know, everything getting cheaper so that you can just like chain through your whole deck practically. That makes sense. But if it's just upgrading your cards a little bit and allowing you to cast them for cheaper, I'm really not interested in that. So I think you're just not ever going to play this card. Um, even in the decks where you have a lot of instants and sorceries, because you're going to play them before this card anyways, and then you're going to cast a card that kind of at that point doesn't really do anything. So F on Mind Splice Apparatus. I just don't think you should put this card in your deck. Yeah. So moving on, we have Tekathal Inquiry Dominus, 2 blue. This is the mythic indestructible card for blue. So it's a 3/5 legendary Phyrexian, and it has flying. And it says if you would proliferate twice instead. That's already pretty sweet. And 1 Phyrexian blue. Remove 3 counters from among other artifacts, creatures, and planeswalkers you control to put an indestructible counter on it. So base rate, 4 mana 3/5 flyer. That's already like a B, bordering on B plus. And then proliferating twice every single time allows you to really spread the oil. And if you play this again on 5 mana, you can almost instantly make it indestructible. So we talked about how insane that is. And getting to proliferate twice is just going to end the game so quickly with all the oil payoffs and just poisoning your opponent. Like you can really, really go off with like poisoning your opponent twice as fast. Like they're going to die pretty readily. So I think just A minus for Tekathal. Like it's better the more proliferate and that kind of thing you have, but the fact that it's a 3/5 flyer base rate with a ton of upside is pretty incredible. So yeah, if you open that card, it's gonna be great. Then we have Unctus Grand Metatect. It's 1 blue for a legendary artifact, Phyrexian Vidalkin at rare. It's a 2/4, and it says other blue creatures you control have whenever this creature becomes tapped, draw a card and then discard a card. So it turns all your blue creatures into looters, basically when they attack, or if you have some other way to tap them. And it says other artifact creatures you control get +1/+1, and you can pay a Phyrexian blue. It says until end of turn, target creature you control becomes a blue artifact in addition to its other colors and types. Activate only as a sorcery. So you can turn any creature into a blue artifact creature, which means it gets the bonus +1/+1 from this creature and turns it into the looting ability. So that's pretty amazing, right? You could paying 2 life to be able to loot and then make something bigger at sorcery speed is nice because maybe you can get a toxic creature through. So it really helps you attack. And then on top of that, it smooths out your draws. It doesn't count itself when it attacks, right? It doesn't loot itself, but it's a 3 mana 2/4, so it blocks really well. All in all, this card is somewhere between like a B and B plus. It's super strong. If you don't have a lot of other creatures in play, then the +1/+1 ability is not that fantastic. But if you do base more blue, right, then you don't have to pay too much mana to be able to. Well, I guess you really care about the creature being an artifact, so you're often going to need to use the ability to actually pump something up, right? Unless you just have an artifact creature. But assuming you just build a normal blue deck and put Unctus in it, you're going to have artifact creatures somewhat and blue creatures somewhat, and then you can fill in the gaps with the activated ability. I think it's not quite a B plus because it does take a little bit of work, but it has a good base stat rate with a lot of good abilities. So B for Unctus, pretty powerful card, and could you can make it work even better than that. All right, moving on to black. First up, we have Archfiend of the Dross. 2 black for a Phyrexian demon at rare. It's a flying 6/6, so 4 mana for a 6/6 flyer, like that. It enters the battlefield with 4 oil counters on it, and at the beginning of your upkeep, remove an oil counter from Archfiend of the Dross. Then, if it has no oil counters on it, you lose the game. Okay. And it also has another ability. Whenever a creature an opponent controls dies, its controller loses 2 life. So you get a 4 mana 6/6 flyer, and you get to attack with it 3 turns, right? Because the first turn it can't attack. Then you remove an oil counter from it, and then it has 3 left at that point. So you get 3 attacks and win with it. So potentially dealing your opponent 18 damage just right there. And then it says whenever a creature an opponent controls dies, its controller loses 2 life. So if you can also kill some things from your opponent or force them into some awkward trades, then it's also going to kill them that way. But if you can also proliferate and keep the oil going, you're not just going to die to the Archfiend of the Dross. So if you have, let's say, no ways to proliferate, no ways to add oil to this card, it gives you 3 turns to win the game, but it's a huge flying creature. So how good is that? That's probably like, still probably like a B minus, because I can imagine a lot of board states where a 4 mana 6/6 flyer with upside can win the game in 3 turns. But even if you proliferate just a little bit, like you probably only need to put 1 or 2 oil counters on this to win the game. Then suddenly that's not very difficult because black is kind of designed to do that. So as long as you're putting in the work and you have ways to support this card, it's going to be really good. So I think what I'm going to say is like it's kind of like a build around B plus, because while it's incredibly good, it does have a fail state that makes you lose the game. So you have to be a little bit careful. But if you build around it, if you have some ways to add oil counters, if you have some ways to proliferate, the card's going to basically win the game in short order. And your opponent's going to either have to kill it, in which case, fine, you get out of the claws, or they're going to die. So you're happy with that. And so build around B plus for Archfiend of the Dross. Super, super cool card. We have Black Sun's Twilight. So it's Black's version of this X spell. So this one costs X and a black for a rare instant. It says up to 1 target creature gets -X until end of turn. And then if X is 5 or more, return a creature card with mana value X or less from your graveyard to the battlefield tapped. So for 4 mana, you can give something -3/-3. So you can kind of kill something for like 4 or 5 mana. That mode of the card is not great because you're always kind of overpaying for it, right? Where the X, you're attaching it to the mana cost. So you're probably killing whatever your opponent's creature is plus like a mana. So that alone, don't love that. But if you ever pay 6 mana, you get to kill basically almost anything. And you get to bring a creature value that's, 5 mana or less likely. So basically you get to bring anything back. So at like 6 or more mana, kill something from your opponent, bring something back. That's really, really good. So it's not great early on, but you can still use this in pinch, right? Like 4 mana, -3/-3 if you're behind. That's not the worst. Like having that as an option is good, like with that modality. And then later in the game, it's just kill their best thing and then 2 for 1 and bring back your best thing. How good is that? That's probably like a B plus. Maybe just a B. The card is clunky. I will say that. It's not efficient. And you kind of have to spend a lot of mana to get the 2 for 1. So actually, you know what? I think I'm just going to go B on the card. It's a little bit too much mana for what you're getting. If you compare this to like the blue one, rather than spending all that mana to take your opponent's best thing and make a copy of it, that's like a 3 for 1. That card's clearly like an A, right? I think I gave it an A minus, but I think probably actually should just be an A. That card was really, really good. Actually, I'm gonna fix that right now. No, I just gave it an A. Yeah. So the blue version of this card, I just gave an A for because it's basically just a 3 for 1. But the Black Sun's Twilight's like a 1 for 1 or 2 for 1 with setup cost. So yeah, okay, about a B for that one. It's a good card. You'll take it often, but it's not always a windmill slam. Next up, we have Drivnod, Carnage Dominus. This card costs 3 black for the black version of this indestructible god thing. So it's an 8/3 legendary Phyrexian horror at Mythic. And so for 5 mana, 8/3, it says if a creature dying causes a triggered ability of a permanent you control to trigger, that ability triggers an additional time. And then it has Phyrexian Black. Exile 3 creature cards from your graveyard to put an indestructible counter on Drivnod Carnage Dominus. So far, everything, all of these like crazy god things or whatever they are, can get their indestructible counter on 5 mana. And so this kind of continues the trend, right? Where if you have 5 mana, you play it and you can instantly exile 3 creature cards from your graveyard to put the counter on it. And what's nice is it kind of curves, right? Where if you play like a 2 and a 3 drop or 3 and a 4 drop, you're going to have those things die. Now, probably you're not going to have exactly like 2, 3, 4 and have that all die by the time this comes down. So it is going to take a little bit more setup cost before this thing becomes indestructible. And if it's not indestructible, this only has 3 toughness. So your opponent could like Volt Charge it, and they can remove it through other means too. So it is a little bit more vulnerable, but it's also a 5 mana creature with 8 power. So once it's indestructible, it's going to hit hard. Like your opponent quickly goes into the abyss and needs to start just chump blocking this every turn or take 8. And I think its ability is pretty nice because if we think about like specifically black white or black red, where you have these creatures that have all these death triggers, getting a second death trigger out of everything is very, very strong. So I think the setup cost is higher for this card than the white and the blue ones, because I think the rate is worse. But I think the ability is a little stronger. I think the proliferate one in blue is better, but I think this one is probably a little better than the white one in limited. But I do think the 5 mana 8/3 mode without the indestructible is kind of just not that impressive. So I'm going to give this card a B plus because I think you can't just curve out with it and win right away, but it's still incredible. So I mean, you're gonna basically take it every time. Next up, we have Geth, Thane of Contracts. Costs 1 black for a legendary Phyrexian zombie at rare, and it's a 3/4. And it says other creatures you control get -1/-1. And it has 1 black tap. Return target creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield. It gains if this creature would leave the battlefield, exile it instead of putting it anywhere else. Activate only as a sorcery. So a 3 mana 3/4, that's pretty nice. But it also shrinks your entire team. So other creatures you control get -1/-1. What that means is you fundamentally have to have your deck be built differently, right? Where you can't put any X1s into your deck if you're playing Geth because they just die, which is a pretty big bummer. Unless the X1s have some sort of utility when they die, then maybe like if you're using it as sort of a combo engine, it's fine. But shrinking your entire board is a huge cost, obviously. So you have a couple options, right? Where you can play fewer creatures in your Geth deck if you're more of like a control deck, where the -1/-1 doesn't hurt as much and you're trying to just control the board via other means. And then if one of your other big creatures that you're playing does die, you get to bring it back, and then it gets another go around with the Geth. So that's actually pretty enticing. The other strategy is if you're playing kind of a more mid-rangey deck with a bunch of, 2/3s, 3/3s, etc., and they have a lot of good enter the battlefield effects or leave the battlefield effects, the fact that you're shrinking them doesn't matter as much because then you can start bringing them back and re-buying all those enter the battlefield effects. So Geth can actually be pretty good there too. But this is a fun one because it's kind of hard to evaluate. I would say that if you can really maximize the build around either by having only other big creatures or having a lot of enter the battlefield effects and leave the battlefield effects triggers, Geth's going to do a lot for you. If you just put it in a random deck, I think the downside of shrinking your whole board is pretty real. So I think it's kind of like a build around B, where you need to strategically build around Geth, and it's going to be pretty awesome there. But if you just put in like some random deck, then it's probably more like a C minus, where it is a 3 mana 3/4, but might actively be bad for you. So yeah, I mean, it can never be that bad, I think, because what can happen with Geth is you shrink your board, but it turns your other creature into a chump block that you can bring back the next turn. And it's also a 3/4 itself, so you can always trade off the Geth. I think it's a good card, but it is kind of funky and weird. So that's a fun one to examine. So B, build around for Geth. Next we have Kerumonix, the Rat King. So it's 1 black for a legendary Phyrexian rat at rare. It's a 3/3. It has Toxic 1. Other rats you control have Toxic 1. And whenever Caramonyx enters the battlefield, look at the top 5 cards of your library. You reveal any number of rat cards from among them and put the revealed cards into your hand. Put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. So I believe there's a common rat and an uncommon rat we looked at before. So you could have some copies of those, but it's basically a 3-mana 3/3 Toxic 1. That's already a decent rate. Nothing like crazy. A 3-mana 3/3 Toxic 1 is like a C plus because it costs black, so it's a little hard to cast. So C plus on base rate for Caramonyx, and then let's say you have like 2 other rats in your deck, then some small percentage of the time you're going to find a rat with it, and those times are going to be good. But I don't think this is like the full on, I'm taking all the rats with Caramonyx. I think like it's fine, but it doesn't even really help you punch through with the rats, right? It gives them Toxic 1, but not like any Death Touch or anything like that. And at the end of the day, well, it can take as many rats as you reveal. So it's not like, so getting more and more rats actually is a good thing, where you could, in a deck of, excuse me, in a deck with like 10 rats in it, you could actually get, 2 rats of this pretty consistently, but that's not really going to happen. So if we evaluate it mostly as a 3-mana 3/3 Toxic 1, that's kind of like a C plus. I think I'm just going to give it a C plus, and sometimes you're going to have more rats and it's going to be better than that. But I think a lot of people are going to look at this and be like, oh my gosh, like this card's so powerful because I'm going to get all the rats and it's going to be great. I don't think that's what you want to do with it though. Next up we have Phyrexian Arena, an oldie but a goodie. So this is 1 black. It's a rare enchantment. It says at the beginning of your upkeep, you draw a card and you lose a life. So, used to be, this effect was great because limited was slower. You could just play this on turn 3 and no one would have put anything on the board yet. And then every turn you draw a card and you just trade with your opponent over and over, and then you win the game with card advantage. Times have kind of changed where you can't just sit around and do nothing. Basically, to make Phyrexian Arena work now, you need to either be the aggressor and then use it to refuel your hand, or you need to trade, and then play Phyrexian Arena later, and then you can start drawing cards that way, and then enact your game plan. So like not playing until like turn 5 or 6. So there's a lot more setup cost to Phyrexian Arena than it used to have, just because of the context of limited. That being said, the card is still pretty powerful, but it's not like insane, right? If you can't put it on board because you're already behind, it's really actively bad. It's like worse than just having, a 2/3 for 3. If you're already ahead, it's quite good. And at parity, it can be good in the right circumstances. What is that all in all? It's probably like C plus. I don't even really think it's like in the B minus territory. I think you probably take, the good removal spells over this, those Bs that we talked about in the common uncommon set review. So I'm going to give C plus for Phyrexian Arena. It kind of hurts, but it's just kind of so slow, and also it hurts you quite a bit. If we compare it to the Skrelev's Hive, which is you're losing a life every turn, but it gives you a 1/1 might every turn, and it costs less, and it gives all your toxic creatures lifelink. That's what we're looking for in this type of effect these days, and that got a B. So if that's a B, then it makes sense that Phyrexian Arena is only really a C plus. Phyrexian Obliterator is the classic BBBBB. So 4 black mana for a 5/5 Phyrexian Horror at Mythic. It's a reprint and it says trample. And whenever a source deals damage to Phyrexian Obliterator, that source's controller sacrifices that many permanents. Pretty much like a similar card as the white version that we saw, which was kind of a build around A, right? If you can cast Phyrexian Obliterator, it's going to be incredible. Like, going to be obviously the best card in your deck. But you really need at least 14 or 15 swamps in your deck to even consider playing it. So I'm basically the same thing here. I'm not going to go too far in depth on it. If you can go mono black, then you should play this card. It's going to be incredible. If you're going to first pick it, out of a pack, I would do so if the pack was a little bit weaker, or, you're just trying to live the dream. But it's really not the type of card that you can just force, I don't think, because you have to really commit to being mono black unless you can fill it in with a ton of artifacts. Like if this card were in Brothers War, I could actually see a world where, this is so strong that you kind of warp your pick orders to play a bunch of colorless cards to make your Phyrexian Obliterator work. But I don't think in limited it's going to necessarily work out that way. but we'll find out. Yeah, obviously the card in constructed is a lot easier to make work, and that's going to be sweet. Okay, but for limited, next up we have Vran Executioner Thane. 1 in a black for a 2/2 legendary Phyrexian vampire at rare. It says whenever one or more other creatures you control die, each opponent loses 2 life and you gain 2 life. This ability triggers only once each turn. So 2 mana 2/2, I mean, that's playable rate as is. That's kind of like a D plus by itself. But anytime an opponent's creature dies, you get to drain them for 2. That's a lot of damage. As soon as your opponent has, 2/2 of their own or a 2/3 or whatever, Vran kind of takes on the role of being an enchantment where it's not really going to interact in combat very often. But it does. So if it trades with an opponent's 2/2, it does, I think, check because they both go to the graveyard at the same time, and then it was still like in play as it left. So I think even if it trades with an opponent's 2/2, you're going to drain, and that's already pretty nice upside for combat. And then if it ever sits around and anything else is going on, your opponent basically can never, just play a normal game of Magic and trade because Vran is just going to completely take over the game. So they kind of have to race you in a way where they're not going to trade creatures, or else Vran's just going to win. So it's going to make life incredibly awkward for your opponent. And so that alone is like already kind of like a B. And I think I could, like, if you compare this with removal that actually kills your opponent's creatures, then it's probably more like a B plus, A minus. I'm gonna go B on it because I think it's really strong, but its stats alone are like not that impressive. But it's gonna be a really, really good card, I think. So B for Vran. I really like that one. And we'll have to see it in action. I could imagine a world where like I'm even underrating it here. And then for some planeswalkers here, we have Vraska Betrayal's Sting. So 4 in a black and a Phyrexian black mana. And it's legendary Vraska at Mythic. And like the other completed planeswalkers, this one obviously has completed. So you can pay 4 in a black. So 5 mana and you get a 4 loyalty planeswalker. So 4 in a black and 2 life. Or you can pay 4 black and you get a 6 loyalty planeswalker. And what does Vraska do for that? So either 5 or 6 mana. Well, on 0, it says you draw a card and you lose a life, proliferate. So that's already pretty good. Starts ticking up herself and you're drawing cards to get ahead and proliferating everywhere else, giving your opponent poison counters. Life's all great there. So that's nice. Loss of life will add up over time, though, so be careful. Has -2 loyalty. Target creature becomes a treasure artifact with turns into a treasure. So -2, turn a creature into a treasure token. Okay, that's pretty sweet. Now with that, if it's coming in with 4 loyalty and you -2, Vraska's already down to 2 loyalty at that point, so she can be attacked pretty easily. But if your opponent has like only one good thing, killing that and then threatening to start ticking up and taking over the game is pretty nice. And then Vraska has -9. If target player has fewer than 9 poison counters, they get a number of poison counters equal to the difference. So not just win the game, but pretty much. Like if you have that and any way to proliferate or just punch through the last poison counter, then Vraska is basically 9 mana to win the game. So in the 6 mana mode, if it comes down, Vraska ticks up immediately to 7, 8, 9, and then can threaten the ultimate. So it's 4 turns away from the ultimate in the expensive mode, which means the soonest you'd be activating the ultimate without Vraska being attacked is like turn 10. So pretty slow, but by that point you've already proliferated a bunch, made your opponents lose a bunch of life. So I wouldn't really count Vraska for the ultimate because I think while that could come up and it's nice, we're really evaluating this card as a 5 or 6 mana planeswalker that is build your own Phyrexian Arena, but you're proliferating every time. So that's substantially better than Phyrexian Arena. And protects itself and kills your opponent's giant things by turning them to treasure tokens. So how good is that? I think it's pretty good. I think it's a little bit worse than some of the other planeswalkers because she kind of starts with a vulnerable amount of loyalty on if you need to come down and just if it comes down to -2s, because she'll only have like 2 loyalty left. But the fact that you play that on 5 mana and still have a planeswalker left means you could just not attack and then kill whatever actually was going to get through and then start building up Vraska. So that's actually really impressive. So I was maybe thinking like Vraska would be like a B plus, but she's actually pretty easy to protect on her own. So I think she's just in the A range. So A minus for Vraska, incredible card. Gonna take her out of most packs, and then yeah, Phyrexians have won here. Okay, quick sip of water, and then on to red. Okay, in red we have all will be one. So this is like in those movies or TV shows where they say whatever the name of the movie is, and then you go, oh, name of the movie, and it's tongue-in-cheek reference. So what does this card do? Well, it's 3 red red for a mythic enchantment, and it says whenever you put one or more counters on a permanent or player, all will be one deals that much damage to target opponent, creature an opponent controls, or planeswalker an opponent controls. So we're talking about um, toxic counters, or sorry, poison counters and oil counters, and I guess loyalty counters, but probably not. So 5 mana does nothing on its own. That's not good. And also, it doesn't work with the non-creature triggers for adding oil counters. Like if you play this and you get your oil counters, then it comes down and it doesn't even work there. So you have to like play it and then do something else after that to even get going with anything. But it does work with playing it and then attacking with toxic creatures because you could immediately get some triggers off that. However, it's in red, which makes it pretty problematic, right? Because that's not what we're really about here. Red's more about the oil. So if you pair it with other colors, you can get, oil and poison counters, and it is a build around and can be good. Like if you look in maybe in blue red, where you can get your opponent to have a couple poison counters, and then you start proliferating all the oil counters as well. Then, oil counter here, there, everywhere. I think the way it works is that um, it checks for each permanent that you're putting counters on or each player. So if you proliferate and you put an oil counter on 3 different things and a poison counter on your opponent, I think you get 4 different deal ones. Basically, I believe that's how it works. So it's nice that you can split up the damage, and so that's pretty sweet. So it works really well with proliferate. I imagine if it can deal like 3 damage the first use off of proliferate, then it's going to be pretty good. So how hard is it to play this and then play a spell with proliferate and trigger like 3 different things? Well, all that requires is your opponent having a poison counter and then you having 2 things that care about oil. That's actually, I think, not actually too hard. So there's a lot of setup costs to play a 5 mana enchantment, do nothing. But after that, all your cards get way, way better. So I think it's kind of like when you actually build around it and all that comes together, then it's probably like a build around B because it's really, really strong, but it is 5 mana, do nothing. In most decks, the card's like just not playable because you need to have a lot of proliferate for it to really matter. But I think in like blue red specifically, it might be a card to look out for. Or red black oil, where just oil's going everywhere, or like red green oil could actually be good. But if you really build around it, it does seem pretty sweet. Next up, we have Capricious Hellraiser. This one's 3 red, red, red. So not quite like the Phyrexian Obliterator level. This one's a little easier to cast, but not a ton. So for 6 mana, you get a 4/4 flyer. And this is a Mythic Dragon, by the way. But it has, this spell costs 3 less to cast if you have 9 or more cards in your graveyard. So 9 or more cards in your graveyard is about half of your deck. So you've already drawn like 20 to 24 cards in your deck. So we're looking already towards the mid game for you to have the cheaper version of this card. Or sorry, not the mid game. We're looking to the late game. But even if you don't have 9 cards, you're probably gonna have 6 mana before you have 9 or more cards in your graveyard. That part's not a huge deal, just lets you double spell. But then it also has, whenever this enters the battlefield, exile 3 cards at random from your graveyard. Choose a non-creature non-land card from among them and copy it. You may cast the copy without paying its mana cost. So it checks all the cards in your graveyard, but then if any of them are, any of the chosen ones at random are non-creature non-land cards, aka, excuse me, if any of them are spells, then you get to copy those and play those for free. So, how good is a hard to cast 4/4 flyer that maybe draws and plays a card for free? Pretty good. Again, you really want to have like 12 red sources, I think, to be able to play this because it is red, red, red. So you kind of want to really base it in that direction. You can play it with like 9, 10, 11 sources. Just know that you're not always going to cast on turn 6. But yeah, I mean that's pretty strong. You want to build it more in like a blue red spells direction, but even if not, um, I would say if you have like at least 6 to 8 spells, then you sometimes will get lucky to for 3 of those to be like one of them among the hits of 3 things. Also notably, like if you have 2 creatures and a spell in your graveyard, it's always gonna hit those 3 at random, and then you get to just cast that spell. So the fewer cards in your graveyard, sometimes actually the more control over this Hellraiser that you have, which is kind of interesting tension. Either you go like gung ho all in with it, or you're sort of more balanced and you're just trying to make sure you have enough spells to sometimes get lucky with it. Because at the end of the day, it's also a 4/4 flyer. So kind of an interesting one to grade here. I kind of think at the end of the day, it's kind of just a B because it's pretty hard to cast. It's a 4/4 flyer, which is big, but not like the end of the world. And then, yes, you can get a spell back and cast it, but it's a bit of work for that. So as far as like mythic dragons go, this is nowhere near like the unbeatable ones. Much stronger and like constructed where you can build your whole deck around this. But yeah, I like the Hellraiser. I think it's just does require a bit of work. Then we have the Dragon Wing Glider. So this is 3 red for a artifact equipment at rare, and it has the ability, so everyone playing at home, for Mirrodin. Equipped creature has +2/+2 and flying and haste. So for 5 mana, you get a 4/4 flying haste. So already it's a dragon. Honestly, I kind of like that a lot more than the Hellkite we just looked at. And then it has equipped 3 red, and so you can move this and give something else +2/+2 flying and haste for 5 mana. So if they happen to kill your first dragon, you can move it onto something else and make an even bigger dragon. I mean, that's just silly. Like this card's just going to come down and in the game in a couple turns, and then if it doesn't, it's going to end the game a few turns later because you moved it. So I'm just what A- for this card. The card's completely obnoxious. If your opponent doesn't answer it, it's basically just game over. And then it even is for Mirrodin, so if they answer it, you still at least have a 2/2 on top of that. Yeah, like what a card. That's incredible. Koth Fire of Resistance is our red planeswalker here. Costs 2 red for a 4 loyalty Koth at rare. So it's not completed, so always costs 4 mana. And so 4 loyalty planeswalker has +2. Search your library for a basic mountain card, reveal it, put it in your hand, then shuffle. Okay, so that's kind of nice. +2 is a lot to tick up with. So already kind of just really chaining up the loyalty. Then it has -3. Koth deals damage to target creature equal to the number of mountains you control. Now, generally we're playing, 2 color decks. So with a 9/8 mana base, if you play this on turn 4, you go get a mountain. The next turn, let's say you have 3 or 4 mountains in play. That's going to kill a good number of things that you really care about. And notably, Koth goes from 4 to 6 loyalty. So if you need to, you can use the -3 twice in a row to kill 2 things. Or most likely you're going to kind of tick up and then alternate killing things and ticking up Koth. And then on top of that, it has -7. You get an emblem with whenever a mountain enters the battlefield under your control, this emblem deals 4 damage to any target. Wow. So in limited, probably what's mostly going to happen is you play Koth, tick up, and then unless they have something that really needs answering, you just tick up one more time, threaten the ultimate, and then ultimate, and you've held those 2 mountains you went to go get. And then you have basically 2 deal 4s just sitting in hand, and all future mountains are also deal 4s. That's really good. Now, Koth is a little bit hard to protect on its own, just in the sense that if you don't have enough mountains in play when Koth comes down, the -3 is not going to do anything, or it's not going to do enough. Like if your opponent has a 5/5 and you can't deal with it, then Koth can be a little bit awkward. But really threatens the ultimate quickly, and the ultimate is just pretty game winning. I think a little bit worse than some of the other planeswalkers we've looked at, but Koth still gets, I think, a B+. Like there's a little bit more setup to Koth, but also goes over the top very, very quickly. So yeah, pretty great card. Next, we have Red Sun's Twilight. So the red version, we have it's X red for a rare sorcery. It says destroy up to X target artifacts. If X is 5 or more, for each artifact destroyed this way, create a token that's a copy of it. Those tokens gain haste. Exile them at the beginning of the next instep. So if your opponent has 2 artifacts in play, you can pay 4 mana to destroy 2 of them. Okay, cool. And then if you have a ton of artifacts, it doesn't even help you to blow up all your own artifacts because you get copies of them, but they're all blown up. So it's not like you're doubling up or doing anything cool with Red Sun's Twilight there. You're not getting a ton of copies of them on your own things. Unless they care about going to the graveyard and then you get copies, then maybe something you can finagle, but it's really not about that. So how many artifacts are going to be running around? I think there's going to be enough artifacts where you want to play Red Sun's Twilight main, because if you ever can spend 4 mana and destroy 2 artifacts, that's a huge game. So I think the upside of playing this main deck versus not being able to hit anything is worth it. So I think it's more like you sideboard it out versus not playing it. And also there's a bunch of, mites running around, which are artifacts, and blue has a bunch of artifacts. So there should be enough for it to get decent targets, and it's powerful enough to incur that risk. But just know you're gonna have to sideboard out Red Sun's Twilight in best of 3. Like if it wasn't good in game 1, that's gonna be common. And how good is it? Oftentimes you're only blow up like 2 or 3. Now what you can do is it says destroy up to X target artifacts, and if you pay X is 5 or more for each one that's destroyed, you get a copy. So you can pay 7 mana, and even if your opponent only has 3 artifacts, you get copies of them, and they gain haste. So if your opponent has a bunch of might tokens, or if they have a big artifact creature, or a big if they have a bunch of 4 Mirrodin equipments, you get those 4 Mirrodin equipments, and then the tokens, the 2/2s, will stay around even if the 4 Mirrodin goes away. So I mean, there's a lot of upside to the card, and just know that on 7 mana, even if there's not 5 or more things, you can still spend 7 mana to get the copies. So I still think on average this card's going to be like a C plus, because it's not going to hit everything that you want, but it's like one of those really powerful C pluses where sometimes it's just going to be like an A minus, where you wipe their board. They had 3-4 artifacts in play and you blew it all up for 6 mana. Or sometimes it's going to be like an F because your opponent's just not playing any artifacts. So on average, I think this card's kind of going to be like a C plus, but it is going to be pretty powerful. Also, if you can include some cards like Rummagers or Looters in your deck, like there's a red 1/3 for 2 mana at common that we looked at that rummages. So if you happen to have like Red Sun's Twilight, that card goes up in value because it lets you play it main deck and just rummage it away if it happens to not be good in the matchup, which is especially important in best of 1. Next up, we have Slowbad Iron Golem. It's 2 and a red for a 3/3 legendary Phyrexian Goblin Artificer at rare. This is like some old goblin from before that's been Phyrexianized. So 3 mana 3/3 has tap, sacrifice an artifact, add an amount of red mana equal to the sacrificed artifact's mana value. Spend this mana only to cast artifact spells or activate abilities of artifacts. So how relevant is it to sack artifacts to be able to spend it on big artifacts? Probably not very relevant. I mean, there will be board states where Slowbad's ability will come up, but for the most part, I think you're basically getting like a 3/3 for 3 with a little bit of upside. So how good is that? Probably like a C plus. If it didn't have the ability, it'd be between a D plus and a C minus. I think 3/3s for 3 are pretty much C minuses that are fine these days. Like it's Centaur Courser. The fact that you sometimes can go off with the ability and do a bunch of cool stuff and maybe cast some big 4 Mirrodin equipment ahead of time, yeah, that's a C plus, but don't go crazy over Slowbad. It's definitely not that exciting. All right, the red Dominus is Solfim Mayhem Dominus. 2 red for the 5/4 legendary Phyrexian Horror at Mythic. This one says, if a source you control would deal non-combat damage to an opponent or a permanent an opponent controls, it deals double that damage to that player or permanent instead. And it has 1 red, discard 2 cards, put an indestructible counter on Solfim Mayhem Dominus. So again, for 5 mana, you can indestructible it right away. You're going to have the 2 cards in hand as well. So basically on turn 5, you're always going to be able to indestructible this if that's what you want to do. So that's pretty fantastic. 5/4 is really nice stats as well, because it's not like it hits pretty hard, but also if you can't indestructible it right away, then it's already like pretty sizable. And the ability is quite nice. We've seen like red has quite a bit of different burn spells. So doubling up on your shock to deal 4 damage all of a sudden is pretty amazing. Your Volt Charge deals 6. So that's a pretty relevant ability, and pretty easy to just, like I said, give this indestructible if that's what you care about. So how good is that? Really good, for sure. Again, the fact that it's only like it's a 4 mana 5/4, it's still possible to kill it. So you kind of want to wait till turn 5 before dropping this thing. But indestructible creatures are just incredibly hard to deal with. Now, it doesn't just completely invalidate everything your opponent is doing. It doesn't have flying, so they could go around it. Um, and discarding 2 cards is a real cost. So I think again, it's not like quite as good as some of these other cards, and it doesn't kill anything when it comes into play or anything like that. But overall, the card is pretty annoying. So I'm just gonna give it an A minus. Like I don't think it just wins the game every single time, but it's pretty obnoxious, pretty good card. And I could easily see it bumping up to A. So whatever, you're gonna take it. It's gonna be incredible. Urbrass Forge is next. This one's 2 red, 2 and a red for a rare artifact. And it has, at the beginning of combat on your turn, put an oil counter on Urbrass Forge. Then create an X1 red Phyrexian horror creature token with trample and haste, where X is the number of oil counters on the forge. Sacrifice that token at the beginning of the next end step. So you play it, does nothing, but then on your next turn, you get a 1/1 trample haste, and then it dies. The turn after that, you get a 2/1. But the joke, I think, is that you can proliferate onto this or add oil counters. And then, so if you played this on and then got a 1/1, but then the turn after, you put like 2 oil counters on it from some other ability, and now you make like a 4/1. This can scale out of control pretty quickly, assuming it has the support. On its own, it's pretty slow, but it doesn't take that much support to make Urbrass's Forge great, because either you can pair it with some sacrifice synergies so that you're just uh, getting to sacrifice the things before they go away, or you're making it so that the things are bigger and just taking over the game, likely looking for a combo of the two. So how good is Urbrass Forge then? I like it quite a bit. I'm going to give the Forge, I think if you can build around it, it's really good. It's like probably B plus. Most of the time it's going to be like a B minus. But it is slow. I'm going to give it a B minus, but just know that if you happen to build around it, it's going to be even better than that. So I like that card. Next we have Vindictive Flame Stoker, a red, single red for a 1/2 rare Phyrexian wizard. And whenever you cast a non-creature spell, put an oil counter on it. And it has 6 and a red. To sacrifice it, discard your hand, then draw 4 cards. This ability costs 1 less to activate for each oil counter on the Flame Stoker. So you could get all the way up to 7 mana and then just discard to draw 4. That is possible in the late game where you've dumped your whole hand. You play this 7 mana, sack it, draw 4 cards. If you're hellbent, that's pretty good. And then more realistically, if you play this and then over the course of the game, you are playing out your hand and then you play like 2 non-creature spells, kill some things, and you pay 5 mana to sack it and draw 4 cards. I mean, that's just great. It's sort of just a ticking time bomb where it's not particularly aggressive because it's a 1 mana 1/2. So it's not really going to do a whole lot other than maybe stop your opponent's mites from attacking, things like that. But it does kind of threaten to just draw the cards and then hopefully in the game from that point. So I don't think the card like completely wins on its own, but it is pretty strong. The problem I have with it is again, it's kind of more of an enchantment than anything else, where it's just sitting in play, and because it's this small creature, if you ever do threaten to sort of dump your whole hand and then take over with it, if your opponent can see that, oh, okay, you're probably going to use this next turn and you're down to like 1 card, maybe they can use the removal spell there. So it sits in play, and until like turn 6 or 7, it's not necessarily going to do that much. So your opponent has a lot of time to find the answer for it, but it is pretty strong. So like your opponent does kind of have to deal with it, or else it threatens to end the game. So I'm gonna give it a B minus. I don't think it's like incredible, but it does do quite a lot for you for very little mana, single red. Moving on to green. All right, we got some haymakers here. Some haymakers here. First one is Bloated Contaminator. 2 and a green for a 4/4 Phyrexian beast at rare. It has trample and toxic 1, and when it deals combat damage to a player, proliferate. Now, trample on toxic creatures is particularly brutal because if you hit something for 3 and trample over for 1, well, you're still getting the toxic 1. So that's really, really nice. And then you proliferate on top of it, so suddenly your opponent has 2 counters, and on top of that, this is a 3 mana 4/4 already. So it's above rate, has all these abilities, and threatens to take over the game pretty quickly because of the proliferate and the, making oil counters more everywhere, and the poison counters, and just everything. So, um, it doesn't. If you draw this in the mid to late game, it doesn't actually do that much because your opponent can just block it. So for that reason, it's only really amazing in the developing stages of the game. So I don't think that gets it into the A range, but it's so efficient. This thing on turn 3 is just going to win so many games that I can't really go lower than B+. Like, this card is super strong. Then we have Conduit of Worlds next. It's 2 green for a rare artifact. It says you may play lands from your graveyard, and you can tap it to choose target non-land permanent card in your graveyard. If you haven't cast a spell this turn, you may cast that card. If you do, you can't cast additional spells this turn. Activate only as a sorcery. So it allows you to play lands from your graveyard. So if you happen to have a Terramorphic Expanse or 2, it allows you every single turn to start thinning out your whole deck and getting all your lands into play. So that's pretty nice. But it also allows you to cast all your spells again. In addition, if those non-land permanents die, then you can just cast them again. So the only thing you can't do is double spell with it, because it's saying you can't cast additional spells. And so you get locked into the 1 spell a turn. But it's not hard for me to imagine where even, let's say you just have a 3/3. Well, if you have a 3/3 and your opponent attacks, then you can use that 3/3 to trade with your opponent's stuff, and then you just replay your 3/3. And it doesn't take very long for your opponent not to be able to attack, for the Conduit Worlds to completely take over. And it also works on offense, where if you've done that, you can also attack with your things, and then if your opponent blocks, then you just get it back. So it makes sure that you just always have gas. It's a little setup, because if you don't have anything to return, it's pretty clunky. And the land ability is mostly just gravy. But that does seem pretty strong. Like, all it asks you to do is just make sure you don't die, and then set up a board state where you want to just keep casting the same thing over and over again. So B for Conduit of Worlds, really like that one, and gonna be really annoying to play against, right? Because you're just never gonna get rid of your opponent's stuff. Then we have the new Blastoderm. It's Evolved Spinoderm. 2 green for a 5/5 Phyrexian Beast at rare. It enters the battlefield with 4 oil counters on it. It has Trample as long as it has 2 or fewer oil counters on it. Otherwise, it has Hexproof. At the beginning of your upkeep, remove an oil counter from it. Then, if it has no oil counters, sacrifice it. So if you're really old school, Blastoderm was a 4 mana 5/5 fading 4 and couldn't be targeted. And so this card has sort of that generality too, but the first couple turns it's in play, it has hexproof, so your opponent can't target it. That also sets up time where you can protect it, like if you happen to have something like a Gaia's Gift, which obviously isn't in the set, but something to protect it, then once the hexproof turns off, you're ready, right? You have all your mana. And then cashing in hexproof for trample after that is probably actually a decent upgrade, because the thing's going to die soon, but your opponent just can't keep chump blocking it, and so the trample becomes more relevant. So that's pretty nice. Now, what will usually happen is that if your opponent does want to block the Spinoderm, it incentivizes them to block it the first time it attacks, because it goes from 4 to 3 counters. The first time it attacks, they can chump with a 1/1, and then after that it gains trample, and then maybe they can kill it. So it is answerable, and it's not like the best rare ever. At the end of the day, it's a 4 mana 5/5, which is pretty pushed, but it does die eventually. But your opponent can chump it on 1 turn, and then either they can trade for it, or they could take, I guess, 10 damage, right? If they chump it and take 10 damage, then it dies. So how good is that? I mean, it's pretty powerful. I think at the end of the day, though, it's just a B. Like, I don't think... If it was just a 5/5 with all these abilities and stayed around forever, now we're talking. But Magic design has kind of evolved where you kind of do need more from your card. Now, a cool trick with the card is that it has trample if it has 2 or fewer counters. So you can kind of trick your opponent. If you attack the turn after it removes a couple counters and it has trample instead of hexproof, you attack, and if you can proliferate that turn, your opponent might go to remove it, and then you can put a counter on it, and it goes from having trample to hexproof. That's pretty sweet. So if you can, like, keep the oil counters flowing with proliferate and keep this thing around longer, it does make life pretty awkward for your opponent. So sometimes it's going to operate even better than a B, but just base rate on the card, B, pretty simple, pretty powerful. Then we have Green Sun's Twilight next. X and a green for a rare sorcery. This one says reveal the top X plus 1 cards of your library. So if you spend it, if you say X is 1, then you get to look at the top 3. Okay, what does that do? So choose a creature card and or a land card from among them. Put those cards into your hand and the rest on the bottom of your library in any random order. If X is 5 or more, instead put the chosen cards on the battlefield or into your hand and the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. Okay, so we've seen cards like this before where maybe it's like green and 2 to be able to look at like the top 5 cards and find like a creature and or land. Those cards are all pretty marginal. However, this does scale, and so that's pretty great. What you don't want to do is cast this for anything less than its kickered mode, because not getting to put the cards in play and not getting to see that many cards means you really aren't going to find lands and creatures when you want them too much. Like if you spend 4 mana, you get to look at 5 cards for a creature and or land card. But if you really want to find a creature, you spent 4 mana to not affect the board, and it's quite bad. However, if you think of this as more like a curve topper, and you spend 6 or more mana on it, for 6 mana you look at the top 7 cards and get the best creature among those right into play. That is pretty powerful, and it's kind of hard to miss. And also, you can keep scaling up from there. Like if you had 10 mana sitting around, you're going to get to look at 11 cards and try to find your bomb. Um, Now, it's only as good as your best cards are, because you're trying to look for like your best creature card. And if your best creature is, you know, a 5 mana 5/5, that's not actually that exciting. But if you have some crazy mythic or rare to pair with the Green Sun's Twilight, suddenly it's getting much more exciting. So keep that caveat in mind. But I think it is pretty strong. But it's a lot worse than the rest of them. I'd probably say B minus on this card. Like it does, I do kind of want to play it. I think it is powerful enough to go find those good creatures and put them directly into play for 6 mana. But it's not going to be that much better than like a Colossal Dreadmaw 6 mana 6/6 a lot of the time. In fact, that might just be better some of the time. So maybe this is only like a C plus. I guess really more, it's like a C plus. But if you happen to have really, really good bombs you're looking for, then it moves up accordingly. So kind of take it around that level, that C plus level. And then if you do have some bombs, you might want to pick it a little higher. All right, in green are Planeswalker, Nissa, Ascended Animist. So 3 green, green, Phyrexian green, Phyrexian green. So 3 green, green, and then you can either pay Phyrexian green twice. So up to 7 mana or as few as 5 mana. So there's a lot of options on what you get for Nissa. So for 3 green, green, you get a 3 loyalty Nissa, and you also pay 4 life. For 3 green, 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 and 2 life, you get a 5 loyalty Nissa. And then for 3 green, 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 you get a 7 loyalty Nissa. So that's a lot of options. Obviously, the more green you pay, the harder it is for Nissa to cast. So a lot of times, you're going to be casting Nissa for Phyrexian mana simply because you just don't have that many green sources. Because like, you know, Nissa I'm happy to play in a 2-color deck with a 9/8 mana base, even if I'm only playing 8 forests, you know. So if you happen to have more forests, it gives you the option to obviously cast Nissa at higher loyalties with more forests. But what does Nissa do? Well, Nissa has +1 to create an XX green Phyrexian horror creature token, where X is Nissa Ascended Animist loyalty. So you can go from, you know, for 5 mana, the 5 mana mode of Nissa, you go from 3 loyalty to 4 loyalty and you make a 4/4. So that's pretty sweet already because that's going to protect Nissa. And it's going to be hard for your opponent to attack past a 4/4 unless they have like a really wide board or they have flyers. Or they can just kill it and attack past. So already Nissa protects herself that way, and then she threatens to just keep going up from there. And then you get a 5/5 and a 6/6 and etc. So that's pretty insane. Then also Nissa has -1 to destroy target artifact or enchantment. Now we have seen a lot of like enchantment-based removal. We've seen some really good artifacts in the set, artifact creatures, etc. So it's a really nice mode to have. Sometimes you're not going to use that at all, but a lot of times it's going to be fantastic. And then -7 until end of turn for each forest you control. Creatures you get +1/+1 and trample. So like if you have 5 forests in play, +5/+5 and trample to your whole team. So Nissa can threaten that immediately if you pay full retail. But again, a lot of these limited decks are more split down the middle. So generally at that point, you're probably going to get like +4, +5 maybe. But that is going to end the game pretty quickly. Most of the time, that's just game over. Huge overrun effect. And, you know, you've probably been making some tokens up to that point. I think probably the sweet spot is if you can get Nissa on the 3 green, green, green and Phyrexia 2, then she'll come down with 5 loyalty, tick up to make a 6/6, then a 7/7, then you threaten the overrun. And, you know, you're getting at least +3/+3 because you're getting 3 forests in play. So that's kind of what you want to aim for. So Nissa is better if you have like 10 or more forests, but obviously playable with as few as like 6 or 7 because she's just so good. You want to put her in whatever deck. Now, how good is Nissa? Now, she doesn't stop flyers, but she easily protects herself on the ground and makes enormous threats turn after turn after turn and ticks up loyalty to do that. And on a 5 loyalty walker, that is crazy good. Doesn't actually just kill whatever, obviously, because it's a green planeswalker. Doesn't have any way for you to like fight opposing creatures. So it kind of holds it out of the strictly A range, but I'm going to give Nissa A minus. Like, I don't think quite an A, but it doesn't matter because, again, going to be the best card out of most packs. Then we have Thron, Breaker of Silence. Shh. Oh, wait, no, be loud. That's what Thron says. 3 green, green for a 5/5 legendary troll shaman at rare. This spell can't be countered, has trample, and Thron, Breaker of Silence can't be the target of non-green spells your opponents control or abilities from non-green sources your opponents control. So Thron has hexproof from non-green things, if that makes sense. And then as long as it's your turn, Thron also is indestructible. So a 5 mana 5/5 trample, indestructible on your turn, can't die in combat, and also can't be targeted by non-green things. I mean, that is absurd. I think, you know, Thron is 5 mana, but you're not going to want to block with Thron a lot because Thron is indestructible, which means that it doesn't always stabilize the board because your opponent can just maybe kill Thron. Well, they can't even kill Thron because it can't be the target of non-green spells and abilities. So it does kind of protect your board unless they have exactly combat tricks, in which case they're probably playing like green attack decks anyways. I was going to say maybe Thron doesn't quite get in the A range, but it does stabilize the board when it comes down, and it's a 5/5 indestructible, so your opponent can never deal with it on attacks. So yeah, I think actually it is in the A range. So A minus for Thron. What a nasty card. Wow. Then we have Tyrannix Rex for green, green, green for an 8/8 Phyrexian Dinosaur at Mythic. This spell can't be countered and has Trample, Ward 4, and Haste, and also Toxic 4. So 8/8 Trample Ward for Haste comes in, hits for a lot. If you're caring about Toxic at all, also that will end the game relatively quickly, but also an 8/8 will also end the game relatively quickly. The biggest strike against Tyrannix Rex is that it's 7 mana, and there's no like Phyrexian mana to cost reduce it. So the card is incredibly powerful, but also it's 7 mana. It does still die to removal as well, but though the Ward 4 goes a long way. But by that point in the game, if you have 7 mana, probably your opponent has around 7 mana, so they might be able to kill it and pay the Ward 4 as well. So probably you get a good hit in, but if that wasn't enough, then you're I don't know. It's one of those like answer me or die type cards, which is pretty nice to have in your deck for, you know, 7 mana. But I can't give it too great of a grade because it's cost restrictive, both being expensive and green, green, green. So I think B for Tyrannix Rex. But obviously, any time that it comes into play, it's just going to win almost every time. So keep that in mind. Try to cast it. Maybe try to put some extra ramp in your deck, and then it will be a good T-Rex. We have Venerated Rot Priest next. Single green mana for a 1/2 Toxic 1, and it says whenever a creature you control becomes the target of a spell, target opponent gets a poison counter. So basically, the joke is that you're going to target this with your pump spells, also other creatures you control with your pump spells, and then it gives your opponent poison counters. Now, it also has Toxic ones. You play it, you want to attack, and then if your opponent wants to block it, then you can pump it. So basically, no matter what happens, as long as you're pairing it with pump spells, your opponent's going to get some poison counters, and they can't really stop it. So how good is that? Well, it is kind of a build around because without ways to target it, it's a 1 mana 1/2 Toxic 1, which is fine. Like, that's like a C plus level card. I gave the 1/1 in white that dies into a might. I think that was a C plus. So this is probably around a C plus on its own. But if you build around it and you have a bunch of pump spells, this card's going to be much closer to like a B in your deck. So I'm going to give it a build around B, but just know that if you care about Toxic and you don't even have that many combat tricks, it's still going to function kind of like a C plus, and you should take it pretty early. Um, so yeah, nice little toxic enabler there. All right, then we have the final Dominus here. It's Zopandrel, Hunger Dominus. It's 5 green green. So we have another 7 mana creature. This one's a 4/6 Phyrexian horror legendary creature. It's mythic. It has reach, and at the beginning of each combat, double the power and toughness of each creature you control until end of turn. And it has Phyrexian mana for green, and sacrifice 2 other creatures, put an indestructible counter on Zopandrel Hunger Dominus. So probably one of the easiest ones to give the indestructible to, because at that point in the game, you're going to have 2 other creatures, so easy to protect. And then, as soon as you slam it down, it's kind of like it has haste, because it's going to double the power and toughness for all your other creatures immediately. So again, that's going to take over the game, but it also doesn't even have to attack or tussle in combat, and it can protect itself when indestructible. And it happens to have reach, so it stabilizes that way too. So it's like T-Rex, but even better. But it's 7 mana. So while T-Rex was a B, I'm going to give this creature, the old Zopandrel, a B+. I don't think it's an A creature, just it costs 7 mana. But obviously, if you can cast it, it's going to win almost every single game you cast it in. So, incredible card, but again, 7 mana. Okay, and that is the end of the rares and mythics for the single color cards. Next up, we have our multicolor cards. So starting with a nice one here, we have Atraxa Grand Unifier. So this is 3 green, white, blue, black. So 7 mana again. What do you get though? You get a 7/7 legendary Phyrexian Angel at Mythic. Atraxa has flying, vigilance, death touch, and lifelink, so that's absurd. And when it enters the battlefield, reveal the top 10 cards of your library. For each card type, you may put a card of that type from among the revealed cards into your hand, put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order, and it has the reminder text. Artifacts, battles, creatures, enchantments, instants, lands, planeswalkers, and sorceries are card types. So I don't know what a battle is yet. Supposedly it's coming in the next set, March of the Machines. We'll find out eventually. But, even if you only get 2 or 3 cards off of Atraxa, it's also a 7/7 Flying Vigilance, Death Touch, Lifelink. Completely over the top card, but it's 4 colors of mana. Now there is the Manalith variant where it produces any color of mana. So if you did happen to open Atraxa, most of the time you're just going to take it and try to really make sure you have your mana fixing and try to ramp towards it, because not only does it basically win the game on its own if it sits in play, but it draws you a ton of cards, so that even if it happens to die, you're just going to win on top of that. And it beats down really, really hard on its own. Being a 7/7 vigilance flying lifelink means no one can race it. So I think all that said, I mean, it is 7 mana. So I was talking about my hesitation, but it goes even more over the top than these other cards. And I think you can kind of build around it in terms of your drafting to make that even better, because it doesn't require really anything else from you. So for me, it does creep into the A range. I'm going to give it an A-. But yeah, like this card is totally bananas. If you can't cast it, obviously it's bad, but try to build and draft your deck around ways to be able to cast it. And what this means is if you see your opponent like in the Sultai mana base or something, and they happen to be like stretching their mana, maybe this card is something you want to watch out for and try to hold a counter spell for or something. All right. Then our next card is Izuri, Stalker of Spheres. So spheres were those lands that basically you could sacrifice them and draw cards, so that common cycle. So that's what a sphere is. Let's see if that ties in. So Izuri is 2 green blue for a 3/3 legendary elf warrior at rare. And it says when Izuri enters the battlefield, you may pay 3. If you do, proliferate twice, and whenever you proliferate, draw a card. So that's nice. It has nothing to do with spheres. So that light a little bit. So Izuri is a 4 mana 3/3 that you can just play early and then start proliferating and draw cards. But if you happen to have the 7 mana, play it, proliferate twice, and immediately draw 2. Both those modes are pretty nice. The 4 mana 3/3 mode is pretty understated. So if you're playing that and you haven't immediately proliferated, it's kind of easy to kill and not that great. The fact that it's a 7 mana draw 2 and then sits in play and threatens to draw more does make up for that, though, because the 4 mana mode is, like I said, understated, but it's kind of like a C plus based on the ability. And then the 7 mana mode is super strong, so it brings up the card in terms of its modality overall. Overall, I would probably give Azuri like a B. It is going to often require an answer and win the game on its own. Now, what a crafty opponent can do is if you play this and you have the 7 mana, so you can pay 3 immediately to proliferate twice and draw 2 cards. If your opponent can react at instant speed, they can actually deny your card draw. So you do have to be a little bit wary of the instant removal that can mess with Izuri. But that being said, it's still a B for me. All right, next we have Glissa Sunslayer, and it costs 1 black green for a 3/3 legendary Phyrexian zombie elf at rare. It has first strike and death touch. So it's a 3 mana, 3/3 first strike, death touch. Okay. And whenever Glissa Sunslayer deals combat damage to a player, choose one. So you draw a card and you lose a life, destroy target enchantment, or remove up to 3 counters from target permanent. Well, I mean, it's another like B plus or A minus, but 3/3 death touch, first strike, death touch, they can never block it. So what that means is you're attacking them, hitting for 3 most turns, or they're chumping. And then you get to draw a card and lose a life, or remove oil counters from something. Yeah, I mean, even though it's 2 colors, I mean, I have to give this card just an A minus based on efficiency. Now, your opponent can answer it because it's only a 3/3, but they can't answer it in combat. So if they don't have the removal spell lined up, your Glissa Sunslayer is just going to basically take over the game all on its own. And so really, what more can you ask for from your 3 mana card? So yeah, I mean, these rares, they're not missing with this set for sure. What do we have next? Ah, from the other side, the Rebels. Okay, this is Jorkadeen, first Gold Warden. Red-white for a 2/2 legendary human rebel at rare. It has trample. It says whenever Jorkadeen, first Gold Warden, attacks, it gets +X/+X until end of turn, where X is the number of equipped creatures you control. Then, if Jorkadeen's power is 4 or greater, draw a card. So a 2 mana 2/2 trample. Not great. When it attacks, though, it gets +X/+X for equipped creatures. Okay. Then, if you have at least 2 equipped creatures, you get to draw a card. So how good is that? Well, not great. I think if you can curve it into a 4 Mirrodin, equipment, it attacks as a 3/3 immediately, so that's pretty good. But you need to kind of like pump it up. So what you could do, you play the 4 Mirrodin thing, you attack for 3, then you can move the equipment over to Jorkadeen so that its power is 4 or greater, or play another like 4 Mirrodin equipment. It's kind of a build around. Like you have to have a lot of the equipment going for it to start drawing cards and really going off, or you have to invest a lot of mana to move the equipment over to it. So yeah, it's definitely a build around. It's kind of like a build around B because it takes a lot of setup and then it's pretty strong. But in just some random red white deck where you only have a couple equipment and you're not always going to draw with Jorkadeen, it's kind of just a 2/2 trample for 2. So I'm gonna give it a build around B, where if you have like 5 or 6 4 Mirrodin equipment, suddenly now I'm in. But otherwise, it's not really a card you want. Kaito Dancing Shadow is next. 2 blue-black for a 3 loyalty planeswalker at rare. Has the static ability. Whenever one or more creatures you control deal combat damage to a player, you may return one of them to its owner's hand. If you do, you may activate loyalty abilities of Kaito twice this turn rather than only once. So you get to bounce things back to your hand like ninjas, basically. And then it has +1 up to 1 target creature can't attack or block until your next turn. And then it has 0, draw a card. Then it has -2, create a 2/2 Death Touch drone artifact creature token with Death Touch. And when this creature leaves the battlefield, each opponent loses 2 life and you gain 2 life. So the +1 is purely defensive because it makes things not attack or block. But, well, actually, it's not purely defensive because what you can do, +1 on your creature's block or your opponent's blocker, hit them, bounce the thing back to your hand, then their creature can't attack you. Then you could freely draw a card, or maybe you make one of the drones and you keep going from there. Now, pretty low loyalty planeswalker because like for 4 mana, 3 loyalty planeswalker. But the fact that you could immediately nullify their blocker, maybe bounce an ETB creature, tick up twice if you want to protect Kaito, you can get to some pretty high loyalty right away. And if you +1 and then -2, it's sort of like you protected Kaito by nullifying their best thing and then making a 2/2 lifelink, or sorry, a 2/2 death touch as well. So Kaito protects himself super well here. And so that's pretty fantastic. It is a little more setup cost than some of the other planeswalkers. So probably only like a B plus rather than A minus. Although, I don't know, maybe it's still just an A. Because but your opponent can kind of go around Kaito. Like if you have to -2 and you don't have a good attack, then yeah, you get the 2/2, but then Kaito's down to 1 loyalty. And at 0 to draw a card, still kind of low loyalty at 3. I think Kaito is probably only like a B plus because again, that low loyalty requires you to have kind of more of a board presence. And then we have Kaya. Kaya is 3 white white. Sorry, let me say the full name. Kaya Intangible Slayer. 3 white white black black. So really hard casting cost. Well, what do we get? We get a rare Kaya and it has 6 loyalty. So 7 mana, 6 loyalty planeswalker, has hexproof, and then +2, each opponent loses 3 life and you gain 3 life. So goes up really quickly in loyalty, up to 8 loyalty even if you want it. Also, that damage and lifelink swings the race really quickly. Your opponent can't just keep taking 3 every turn. So Kaya threatens to end the game pretty quickly, which is what you expect for 7 mana. Then has 0, you may draw 2 cards, then each opponent may scry 1. Solid, not amazing on a 7 mana planeswalker, I don't think, but solid. Like that will also end the game. So if you need cards, go for it. Then it has -3, exile target creature or enchantment. If it wasn't an aura, create a token that's a copy of it, except it's a 1/1 white spirit creature token with flying in addition to its other types. So you can -3 it, remove their best thing, then Kaya has hexproof, and you also get a 1/1 blocker and whatever abilities it came with. I mean, the card's incredible, but it's also 7 mana. So, and it's also pretty hard to cast. I think, like, but also your opponent can't interact with Kaya at all, right? Only through creature combat because Kaya has hexproof, so it does help quite a bit. However, that casting cost is a lot harder than say Atraxa's because it requires white, white, black, black rather than like one of each. So in a white black deck, like yeah, you're usually gonna have white, white, black, black on 7 mana, but not always. But I think often enough that we can pretty much just say like that's reasonable. But you can't really splash Kaya as much, so she is really restrictive in terms of the type of deck that she can go into. I'm gonna give Kaya, I think, a B plus just because 7 mana is a lot. You know, she is gonna win basically every single time, but um, she can also be attacked. Although it's a ton of loyalty, and she can't really be removed. The fact that she can't be removed by all the opponent's stuff. No, Kaya's still in the A range. Like she's a stupid planeswalker that's powerful. So A minus for Kaya, not quite as good as some of the other planeswalkers at 7 mana, but pretty solid. Then we have Kethek Crucible Goliath. It's 2 black red for a 4/4 Phyrexian Beast at rare. It's a legendary creature. It says at the beginning of your end step, you may sacrifice another creature. If you do, reveal cards from the top of your library until you reveal a non-legendary creature card with lesser mana value. Put it on the battlefield, then put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. So kind of you get to downgrade some things, but if you have a ton of ETBs, then that could work with it. Honestly, more of a constructed type card, I think. Although I will say, if you have steal and sack effects, this is a pretty nice sack effect because you stole the creature attacked and then sacrificed with it. In addition, if you play a creature that's more about its enter the battlefield effect rather than its stats, what you can do is play high costed creatures with really strong enter the battlefield effects and then downgrade them into just better generic creatures that have stats. But I mean, that's not amazing. In the end, though, this is a 4 mana 4/4 with upside. So I think it's pretty solid. I'd just give it a B. I wouldn't go crazy for it. But I do like Keswick. I think it's a good card. And the more you build around it, the better. And then we have Luca, Bound to Ruin. Luca is 2 red and green, and then a Phyrexian red or green mana. So completed. So you can pay 2 red, green, and 2 life. And in that case, Luca comes in with 3 loyalty. Or you can pay 2 red, red, green, or 2 red, green, green. And Luca is a 5 loyalty planeswalker. And Luca has +1, add red, green, spend this mana only to cast a creature spell or activate abilities of creatures. -1, create a 3/3 Phyrexian Beast token with Toxic 1. Or -4, Luca deals X damage divided as you choose among any number of target creatures and or planeswalkers, where X is the greatest power among creatures you controlled as you activated this ability. So Luca can come in at 4 loyalty and pump out some 3/3s, or Luca can come in at 5 loyalty for the 5 mana mode, and if you have like a 5/5 in play, can shoot down 5 damage worth of stuff from your opponent's board. So it can kind of clear the way, protect Luca for the turn, and then you can start like ticking up, dumping your hand, and then start making a 3/3 every other turn. So yeah, I mean that's all amazing. Most likely you're just gonna make a bunch of beasts. So, if you play it on the 4 mana mode, you make a 3/3 with Toxic 1, then you do that again, and then you have the option to kind of change it up. Again, it's a planeswalker that protects itself, makes a bunch of material, and also has a removal mode attached that is pretty easy to use. The only thing holding Luca back is that the 5 mana mode where you're instantly -4, you have to have like a good creature in play already, or else it doesn't really do that much. But if you don't have that and you're a bit behind, making the 3/3 is going to protect Luca pretty well. So again, all that to be said in the day, I think just another A minus. It would probably be an A for me for Luca if the -4 were able to just deal damage without having that creature already in play. But it is limited. You're usually gonna have good creatures in play, so it's not a big drawback. Okay, next we have Malcator, which is the Purity Overseer, 1 white blue for a 1/1 legendary creature, Phyrexian Elephant Wizard at rare. And when Malcator Purity Overseer enters the battlefield, create a 3/3 colorless Phyrexian Golem artifact creature token. At the beginning of your end step, if 3 or more artifacts enter the battlefield under your control this turn, create a 3/3 colorless Phyrexian Golem artifact creature token. So 3 mana for a 1/1 that comes with a 3/3 buddy. And then if 3 or more artifacts enter, you get a 3/3. So this one spots you the first one. So if you could play this, and then you could get like a Might token and play like a Skull Bomb, you could get another 3/3. I think the ambition to try to get the second 3/3, it does check every single turn, but that is going to be pretty difficult, I think. Although the fact that there's so many of these like cheap tokens and ways to make artifacts means that it will sometimes be possible to make another 3/3. However, even just having a 3 mana 1/1 that comes with a 3/3, and you could like blink it or combo it with other things, means that it's not that hard to get a ton of value off of Malcator. But at the end of the day, I think the second ability of making extra 3/3s is more ambition than reality. So the 1/1 body on Malcator is not that impressive, and the 3/3 doesn't have any abilities. So I kind of think Malcator is kind of more like a B minus. If you have a bunch of ways for you to flicker the Malcator, or you, for some reason, think you can make a bunch of extra 3/3s, then obviously this card gets better. But on average, I think it's going to kind of function like a B minus. Next up, we have Melira, the Living Cure. Green white for a 3/3. So 2 mana 3/3 like that. Legendary Human Scout at rare. Melira says, if you would get 1 or more poison counters, instead you get 1 poison counter and you can't get additional poison counters this turn. And then exile Melira, the Living Cure. Choose another artifact or creature. When it's put into a graveyard this turn, return that card to the battlefield under its owner's control. So Melira can kind of function as this way to not get too toxic all at once. And then if you have a really good creature protect, Melira does that too. So overall, just like a very solid card with a bunch of good abilities. None of them are like anything to build around necessarily. Like you just play Melira, Melira's going to do good things and you're going to be happy with it. Really, at the end of the day, just kind of like a B. But, if your opponent tries to kill your 6/6 and you can Melira it back, you're going to be pretty happy about that. So B for Melira, nice card. Pretty excellent. Then we have Miglaw's Maze Crusher. This is 1 red green for a 4/4 legendary beast at rare. Enters the battlefield with 5 oil counters. That's a lot of oil counters. Wow. What do you do with the oil counters? Well, you can pay 1 to remove an oil counter and give Maze Crusher Vigilance and Menace until end of turn. Or you can pay 2 and remove 2 oil counters from Miglaw's. It gets +2/+2 until end of turn. Or you can pay 3 and remove 3 oil counters from it to destroy target artifact or enchantment. So it comes down as a 4/4 on turn 3, oftentimes. And then you have a huge threat of activation because you could remove 2 oil counters, and your opponent has to be able to at least deal 6 to it. But if you have 4 mana, you could even do that twice to turn it into an 8/8. So your opponent can't really tussle with this thing in combat. It's going to be way, way too big. And then in addition, if your opponent is low on life, you can threaten lethal by just menacing it, attacking, and then removing the counters. So if you could spend 5 mana to give it menace and +4/+4, and that's going to end a lot of games pretty quickly. And then on top of that, you could just blow up artifacts and enchantments. So Miglaz is just an incredible beater. Honestly, I think it does get into the A range just because of how efficient it is. And unlike the green 4/4 trample we talked about earlier, Miglaz is great in the late game too. Because you just play it, and then the fact that it can affect the board and blow up artifacts and enchantments, but also threaten to be an 8/8 for a turn, means that I think it's just an A-. Just amazing efficiency. All right, we got some more Planeswalkers. Here we go. So Nahiri, the Unforgiving. So 1 red white and then a Phyrexian red white. So if you pay 1 red white and 2 life, you get a 3 loyalty Nahiri. If you pay 1 red red white or 1 red white white, you get a 5 loyalty Nahiri. So what do you get with those abilities? Well, Nahiri has +1 until your next turn. Up to 1 target creature attacks a player each combat Fable. So it's sort of like the reverse of Kaito, where you make their creature attack you, and then you just get hopefully good blocks off of that, or you win a race that you're trying to you can win a race. Also, it says that doesn't say the creature attacks, it attacks a player. So Nahiri can make it so their creature attacks you rather than Nahiri if that's what you care about. Then you can also +1 to discard a card and draw a card. So Nahiri lets you rummage. Notably, you don't have to discard. So if you have 0 cards, you can +1 to draw a card off Nahiri. That's pretty good. And then you have 0 to exile target creature or equipment card with mana value less than Nahiri's loyalty from your graveyard. Create a token that's a copy of it. That token gains haste. Exile at the beginning of the next instep. Nice. So that's kind of a weird ability. Notably, okay, so yeah, so you could exile the creature or equipment, so you only get to do that once for each card in your graveyard, because then you have to pick a new target the next time. But it is a 0 mana ability, so you get to one shot one more time with all your creatures or equipments in your graveyard, as long as they have 3 or less mana cost, if you're in the 3 mana mode, or 5 or less mana cost if you're in the 5 loyalty mode. Kind of a weird card overall. I think the fact that, I mean, she does protect herself in a weird way where you can make their creature attack you rather than Nahiri. The rummage is good, not great. And then the 0 mode, basically at the end of the day, what Nahiri is saying is that you're going to be the one to win the race because Nahiri makes them force attacks they don't want to make. And then 0 makes it so that when you do trade off, you're going to get to bring things back and get one last swing out of them. And then in addition, that's going to trigger all your ETBs and everything else. I think as Planeswalkers go, I mean, she is tough to rumble with, but she's not going to like just generate so much board presence over time that you just strictly win off Nahiri. She still has the supporting cast around her, so that does keep her out of the A range for me, but Nahiri does seem quite strong. I'm going to give her a B+. Still an excellent, but kind of weird card. So we'll have to keep our eye on Nahiri, though I imagine at the end of the day, still just really good. Our next rare is Ovika, Enigma Goliath. Ovika is 5 blue-red for a 6/6 legendary Friction Nightmare at rare. So 7 mana for a 6/6 flyer. Has Ward 3, pay 3 life. So your opponent has to do both of those. Pay 3 mana and pay 3 life. And then Ovika says, whenever you cast a non-creature spell, create X 1/1 red Phyrexian goblin creature tokens, where X is the mana value of that spell. They gain haste until end of turn. Okay, so you play Ovika, hope your opponent can't really kill it because of the ward. Then you untap, you cast a 4 mana spell, you make 4 1/1s that have haste, and you have a 6/6 flyer. So yeah, it's another one of these like 7 mana win the game cards. Super, super strong. I like it a little bit less than the green Trampler or the green Reach Mythic that doubles all your power, because this is still, I mean, it's a 6/6 flyer, but it's 7 mana, and then it still kind of asks you to do other things. So it's probably more like a B rather than like a B plus, because it is going to just end the game most of the time. But it doesn't just win the game every single time if you untap with it. So can't really go much higher than B for that. Next, we have Rhea Evor, Bane of Bladehold. So it's 2 white black for a 3/4 legendary Phyrexian Knight with at rare. It has Battle Cry. So I'm going to read this one because this is an old ability coming back. The whole joke behind this card is that it's Hero of Bladehold, but now Phyrexionized. So Battle Cry reads, whenever this creature attacks, each other attacking creature gets +1/+0 until end of turn. So notably does not pump itself. All right, so 4 mana 3/4 attacks and pumps the rest of your team. It has, at the beginning of combat on your turn, the next time target creature would deal combat damage to one or more players this combat. Prevent that damage. If damage is prevented this way, create that many mites. So it says the next time target creature. So you have to choose something, but you could choose your opponent's creature if you really don't want mites. Like if you pump their creature, or if you choose their creature on blocks, it's obviously not going to deal damage to players, so then you just attack as normal. But most of the time, I think you probably will want mites, because if you go wide enough, like if you battle cry and you choose a creature that hits your opponent for 3, you get 3 mites instead of 3 damage. And then those are going to attack as 2/1s the next turn, and they'll have Toxic 1. So in the long run, that's probably going to be a lot better. And it still kind of makes it its own army in a can. But this is no Hero of Bladehold. Like, this card is pretty good. It does pump your whole team. It is obnoxious, but you have to choose first, right? And anytime you have to choose first, your opponent gets options. So if you choose a creature that, your opponent can then just block, then you're not going to make any mites. And so that prevents this from being completely insane. So at the end of the day, I do think, I mean, a 3/4 that pumps your whole team for 4 mana is still, well, it only pumps power. So probably just a B. I mean, it doesn't pump itself, and it doesn't pump on blocks, or like doesn't pump defense. So B for Rhea Evor, Bane of Bladehold. A good, cool card, but doesn't quite pull its punches, I'd say. Then we have Tybor. Sorry, Tybor. Then we have Tyvar, Jubilant Brawler, which is 1 black green for a 3 loyalty Planeswalker Tyvar at rare. Has the static ability. You may activate abilities of creatures you control as though those creatures had haste. And then you can +1 to untap up to 1 target creature. And then -2. Mill 3 cards, and you return a creature card with mana value 2 or less from the graveyard to the battlefield. So mostly what Tyvar is going to do is let you attack and give creatures vigilance. And then incidentally, you can bring back small things from the graveyard. That's really not that impressive. It's probably going to play more like a gold, signpost uncommon than a true planeswalker, because a lot of times your opponent can kind of just ignore Tyvar. If you don't have a lot of really good 2-drops, then Tyvar is mostly just going to give something vigilance every turn. And the fact that it's ticking up in all those abilities isn't going to matter that much. Giving haste to like your tap abilities is also pretty cool, but for the most part, Tyvar is kind of more of a constructed card. Now, it can still be good. Like if you build around it and you have enough 2-drops, and you're going to have 2-drops usually because this is limited in 2023. So if you have like the normal 6, 7, 8 2-drops, Tyvar's still going to do a lot in the sense that they trade off, you're going to get them back, which is going to be nice for 3 mana. But I'm going to give it a B- because it doesn't just win the game on its own. In fact, sometimes it doesn't do very much at all. The Tyvar B minus, but it is still a Planeswalker and does cool things. And then we have our final gold rare here. It's Venser Corpse Puppet. It's blue-black for a 1/3 legendary Phyrexian zombie wizard at rare. Venser has lifelink and toxic 1, so kind of cool to have like blue toxic creature here. And whenever you proliferate, choose 1. If you don't control a creature named the Hollow Sentinel, create the Hollow Sentinel, a 3/3 legendary 3/3 colorless golem artifact creature token. So it makes a 3/3 artifact golem. Or target artifact creature you control gains flying and lifelink until end of turn. So the first time you proliferate, you make a 3/3, and then you start sending the 3/3 to the skies and lifelinking with it. On top of that, it's a 2 mana 1/3 lifelink toxic 1. So yeah, I mean that's pretty good. It doesn't require that many hoops to jump through. We saw that proliferate was added to a ton of cards in the set. So Venser, just gonna be good enough most of the time. B for Venser. All right. Rounding things out, we got some artifacts and lands here. So our first artifact is Argentum Masticore. It's 5 mana for a 5/5 artifact creature Masticore at rare. And it has first strike and protection from multicolored. So 5/5 first strike for 5 means in combat, it's almost always going to win combat. And then at the beginning of your upkeep, sacrifice Argentum Masticore unless you discard a card. When you discard a card this way, destroy target non-land permanent an opponent controls with mana value less than or equal to the mana value of the discarded card. So Masticores, you always have to discard cards to keep them alive. However, if you have a 5/5 first strike in play, also has protection from multicolored, and you're discarding cards, which is also kind of turning them into removal spells. Sometimes even if your opponent has tokens, you can discard lands to kill tokens. Then that's pretty fantastic. So Argentum Masticore is still incredible. Yeah, I mean, still going to be like an A pretty much because it's just going to kill a bunch of things and be a 5/5 first strike. So you're basically never going to pass this card. It's going to be pretty much just amazing. A minus for Argentum Masticore, and your opponent has to kill it or they're probably going to lose. So there's a lot of A's in this set. Wow. Filigree Silex is next. It's 2 generic mana for a legendary artifact at rare. You can tap to put an oil counter on it. You can tap and sacrifice it to destroy each non-land permanent with mana value equal to the number of oil counters on it. Or you can tap and remove 10 oil counters from among it and sacrifice it to deal 10 damage to any target. So it's kind of like these blast zone type cards or the cards that like tick up and then hit everything at a certain mana value. Those cards are always like pretty awkward, sort of like Ratchet Bomb. Especially in limited where everything just has like different mana values. So your opponent has like a 2-drop, a 4-drop, a 6-drop. Filigree Silex not really doing any of that. If you are really heavy on the oil, it'll deal 10 damage to your opponent probably, and that's a good way to win the game. But 10 oil counters is a ton. Oh, it's 10 oil counters from among permanents you control. So it's not just on the Filigree Silex. Okay, so I almost misread this card. Okay, so that's a little bit more reasonable. If you're proliferating and you got like 4 things into play, suddenly that's 4 oil counters on it. I don't hate that actually. Because if that is your main mode and you're planning to just deal 10 with the Filigree Silex, and you have proliferate in your deck, I actually think this card's pretty good. So I've changed my tune on it. I think it's kind of like a build around B minus where it's slow and clunky and it's not always going to do what you want. But it's a 2 mana card that can win the game pretty much on its own. So build around, you need to have the oil counters. This cannot just be your only oil counter card. If it is, it's just too bad. But if you're proliferating or you have a lot of oil or both, then actually I kind of like Filigree Silex. So build around B minus for that card. That's pretty interesting. Then we have Graw's Unstoppable Juggernaut. 8 mana for a 7/5 legendary Juggernaut at rare. Juggernauts you control attack each combat at a fail. Juggernauts you control can't be blocked by walls. And other creatures you control have base power and toughness 5/3 and are Juggernauts in addition to their other creature types. So it's 8 mana 7/5 and turns everything you control into Juggernauts, which is pretty funny. How good is that? Well, not that good. I talked about how 7 mana cards basically they win the game on their own, but they cost 7 mana. This is an 8 mana card, and it doesn't even always win the game on its own. Like it's a 7/5, so its stats aren't even that good. I think the card's actually kind of weak. We don't live in a Power Stone world anymore, so it's not like you're just ramping this out. Like in Brothers War, now we're talking. But in this set where we don't have Power Stones, I think this card's like a D. Like technically you can play it if you can get to 8 mana, and you have like a lot of creatures to turn into juggernauts. So it's kind of like a green ramp card, and a lot of the green ramp creatures, or like the green ramp cards, are creatures. So if you can ramp this out and turn all your ramp creatures into juggernauts, that is kind of nice. But that's basically the only application. And I think there, I mean, even so, it's an 8 mana card. So D for Graz. Mirror and Safe House is 3 mana for a rare artifact. As long as Mirror and Safe House is on the battlefield, it has activated abilities of all land cards in all graveyards. Oh, nice. A card I don't need to talk about. Okay, F for that one. Then we have Monument to Perfection next. Two generic mana for a rare artifact. It has 3 untap to search your library for a basic, sphere, or locust land card. Reveal it and put it into your hand, then shuffle. So finding basics or those spheres we talked about. Locusts, I think we'll see a little bit later. Then you can pay 3, and then Monument to Perfection becomes a 9/9 Phyrexian construct artifact creature. Loses all abilities, gains indestructible and toxic 9. Nice. Activate only if there are 9 or more lands with different names among the basic sphere and locust lands you control. So not only do you need 9 lands in play, but they all need different names. That's basically never going to come up. I guess if you collected all of them and built like this weird like 4 or 5 color deck, you could make that work. But mostly this is a 2 mana artifact that you pay 3 to tap and go find a land from your deck, and that's really slow in 2023. So it's almost more of a sideboard card that I think, yeah, it is kind of this set's mazes in. That's a good point. I think if you were playing best of 3, you could maybe board this in a slow matchup, or if you build around it and you actually get 9 different types, then maybe. But it doesn't even have trample, so like you do all this work and you turn it into a 9/9, and then it just gets chump blocked. So I think it's a sideboard card, and it's like a D plus kind of like is for very 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 slow matchups. So sideboard D plus, the most damning of all grades. Soulless Jailer is next. It's 2 generic mana for an 0/4 Phyrexian Golem at rare. It says permanent, or it's also an artifact. Permanent cards in graveyards can't enter the battlefield, and players can't cast non-creature spells from graveyards or exile. I don't think that really matters from this set. We don't have like disturb or anything crazy going on. It's almost like it's a hoser from some other plane. I can't even think of it's like it's a hoser from Innistrad, but we're not on Innistrad, we're on Mirrodin. So 2 mana 0/4 is pretty bad stats. I mean, technically you can play that, so it's a D plus just because it's a 2 mana 0/4, and it's a card you can technically put in your deck, but not really anything that's going to matter in limited. Then we have Staff of Completion, which is 3 generic mana. It's the completed Staff of Domination, which is kind of cool. Good flavor. It's a mythic artifact, and it has 5 abilities. You can tap and pay a life to destroy target permanent you own. You can tap and pay 2 life to add 1 mana of any color. You can tap and pay 3 life to proliferate, or you can tap and pay 4 life to draw a card. You can pay 5 generic mana to untap it and do some more. So you can pay 3 generic mana, and over 2 turns you can pay 8 life to draw 2 cards. This card is just way too costly. I don't think, like, even if you're proliferating a few times, it's not worth paying 3 life every single time for that. I think it was just they wanted a cool callback. It was a mythic. It has all these abilities. Maybe it has some fringe use case in, some commander deck. I have no idea. But for limited, this is just an F. Don't take and play Staff of Completion. But our next one, different story. So Sword of Forge and Frontier is in the sword cycle. So it's 3 generic mana for an artifact equipment at Mythic. Has equip 2. It gives the equipped creature +2/+2 and protection from red and green. And whenever equipped creature deals combat damage to a player, exile the top 2 cards of your library. You may play those cards this turn. You may play an additional land this turn. So as usual, these swords are really powerful. The only issue with Sword of Forge and Frontier is it doesn't really pay you off the first time it comes into play. If you look at the best swords that come in, you get a hit out of it, and then you get a really good activation. Like, one of them makes your opponent discard a card, and you untap all your lands, and then you get to play something as a follow-up. Or Sword of Fire and Ice lets you draw a card and deal 2 to something. This one, yeah, if you flip over the top 2 and there's a land, you can play that off of it. But you can't really do anything else with it. So your opponent can actually kind of take a hit off of Sword of Forge and Frontier, at least the turn it comes down most of the time. It's pretty hard to double spell unless you have some extra mana already lying around. So because of that, it doesn't quite get in the A territory. But protection from red and green means that oftentimes you're going to have protection from like a color that your opponent's playing, and protection is, just absurdly obnoxious. There's a reason they don't print it anymore, except at really high rarities, and infrequently even at that. But your opponent does have to respect this card because once it's come into play, then they can never let that creature through basically, because you're just basically get to draw 2 cards off of it. So with the downside that it doesn't do that much the turn it comes into play. After that, it can kind of completely take over the game. Cards that completely take over the game on their own, I tend to give A's. I don't think this quite gets there because of its downside, but I will give it a B+. I think the fact that it's colorless, it's going to be pretty good in every single deck. It's probably going to be the best card in a lot of decks, means B+ for Sword of Forge and Frontier. Always fun to see those swords. Then we have Tablet of Completion, 2 generic mana for a rare artifact. You can tap and put an oil counter on Tablet of Completion. You can tap to add colorless, activate that only if it has 2 or more oil counters on it. And you can pay 1 tap to draw a card, activate only if it has 5 or more oil counters on it. Wow, this card is slow. So you can play it on turn 2. Hopefully not, because you actually want to play a creature that can impact the board. But you can play it whenever you play it, and you can tick it up a couple times. Then it turns into a mana rock. And then after 5 counters, like even if you proliferated 2 times, that means you still had to tap it 3 times. Then after all that, you can pay 1 to tap it and draw a card. I mean, there's going to be matchups where this card is good, but it's kind of like a D. There's a lot of work you can put into this. If you proliferate like 3 times, then it's pretty good, because then you can immediately draw a card. Like, the best play pattern I can see with this card is like pay 2 mana, play it, tap. Next turn, proliferate. Then it has two counters on it already. Maybe use the mana or maybe put another oil counter. Then you proliferate again the next turn, and maybe proliferate again the following turn, and then you get to draw a card. That's just way too much work. I'm going to give it a D because it is technically playable. And it's really powerful if you just give it to the tap, draw card, 1 tap, draw card status. But it's just, I think, too many hoops to jump through. For our final artifact, we have Zenith Chronicler. 2 generic mana for a 3/1 artifact creature at rare. Whenever a player casts their first multicolor spell each turn, each other player draws a card. So I'm not really going to come up in limited too much, though the uncommon gold cards are really good. So if for whatever reason you don't have any gold cards in your deck, maybe you play this and your opponent's going to give you a card over the course of the game. Mostly it's a 2 mana 3/1, which is kind of like a C- card. And the ability, as long as it's symmetrical, so you have to be careful. But as long as you don't have multicolored cards, it probably moves this up to like a C instead of a C-. So kind of a weird card. It's more of a constructed hoser than anything. Then we have the Blackcleave Cliff Cycle. So there's 5 of these lands, and so all of them, they're the fast lands. So they enter the battlefield tapped unless you control 2 or few other lands. So if it's your first, second, or third land drop, it comes into play untapped, and then it taps for 2 colors of mana. So it's all the allied colors. So Blackcleave Cliffs is the red-black one. Copperline Gorge is the red-green one. Darkslick Shores is the blue-black one. Razor Verge Thicket is the green-white one, and Seachrome Coast is the white-blue one. So all these are reprints. They're really, really good lands, but in limited, they're not really anything that special. They help fix your mana a little bit, and later in the game, like they're worse in limited than they are in constructed, because games go on longer, and you have more land drops, and then they come into play later when you don't want them to. So if you don't draw them early, sometimes they actually do have a downside. Overall, they're probably like C pluses, because they do fix your mana and they can be pretty powerful. But you should not pick them up like super early. And there's no reason. I mean, some of them might be like closer to C's, and some of them might be closer to like B minuses, depending on like their color combination. The decks that really have intense mana intensive requirements. Like if you have a red card in the deck, but you also want white mana, then a red white one of these would be pretty good, although it doesn't exist. But I guess let's say red black is pretty aggressive, right? So if you have a red black deck where you have early black requirements, but also you want to cast your red cards, okay, it's a little better there. But C plus in general for all of those, take them around that level and you'll be happy with them, but nothing special. Okay, then we have a sphere here. This card is Mythics. Mythics is a rare land sphere. It has tap to add a colorless. It has tap to add one mana of any color. Activate only if Mythics enter the battlefield this turn. And then it has 3 tap to make a might. So this is a play off of Tendo Icebridge, which is a card from original Kamigawa, which produced colorless mana, but you could get color mana exactly once. So the way you want to play Mythics is you just wait to the turn where you do need your splash color. You play this, you get your one-time activation, and then from there, it either produces colorless or it's going to allow you to pump out mites. Now, 3 plus tapping it's kind of like 4 mana to make a mite. That is a nice way to use your land later on. And the fact that you get the one shot of any color is pretty fantastic the one time. So this card actually is probably a little more powerful than it looks. But again, in 2023, you can't just spend 4 mana to make, a 1/1 that can't block every single turn. That's kind of its backup plan. And you just put this in your deck in like an 8/8 mana base, and this is your 17th land, and it'll work out from there. Again, I can't really give it much more than like a C plus because you just aren't going to use these land abilities. Well, no, it's probably more like a B minus. You aren't going to use these land abilities all that often, but when you do, it will be good. Then our next land, we have the Monumental Facade, which is another sphere. It's rare. It enters the battlefield with 2 oil counters on it. You can tap to add colorless, and you can tap to remove an oil counter from it to put an oil counter on target artifact or creature, activate as a sorcery. So basically, it spots you 2 oil counters, and some creatures grow with oil counters, like they get +1/+1, literally. Some have really powerful activations. This one's actually really cool with that clunky artifact we looked at earlier, where you could get it to tapping to draw a card a lot faster. Actually like this one quite a bit more than Mythics because all you have to do to use the Monumental Facade here is just basically giving up 1 mana on a turn to add an oil counter to something. And it spots it on land, so it's not taking up a card slot in terms of like a spell slot. So this card actually, I'm also going to give it a B minus because at the end of the day, it's still just a land and it's colorless, so that's a cost. If you have really strong color requirements, you have to be careful about putting colorless lands in your deck. But for the most part, most limited decks can afford one. And so yeah, it's a nice little utility land. Then we have the Mycosynth Gardens, which is another sphere. It's rare. It taps to add colorless. You can pay 1 tap to add 1 mana of any color. So it's kind of like that Shimmering Grotto variant. And then you can pay X tap, and it becomes a copy of target non-token artifact you control with mana value X. So if you have a 4 mana artifact 3/3, let's say, as long as it's not a token, you can pay 4 and tap this, so 5 mana, and then your land becomes a 4/4. So that's also pretty good. It also fixes for colors. I really liked the Crystal Grotto in Dominaria United, where all it really needed to be excellent was attacking on that Scry 1. And here, instead of Scry 1, you get the ability for it to eventually turn into a threat. So, that Crystal Grotto was kind of like a C plus back in the day. This card almost is like a B level card. I think it's probably the best of these 3 lands. That being said, I can't realistically think I'm taking it at like a B level. It's just gonna be doing a lot for you as a land, eventually turning into a threat. But I'm gonna give it a B minus. Just my note that I like it best of the 3 lands I just rated here. And then our final card here is the Seed Core. It's another sphere. It's at rare. It has tap to add a generic mana, colorless mana. You can tap to add 1 mana of any color. Spend this mana only to cast Phyrexian spells, creature spells. I'll note that 90+% of the creatures in this set are Phyrexians. So this is basically a 5-color land. That's already pretty amazing. And then it also has Corrupted. Target 1/1 creature gets +2/+1 until end of turn. And you can only use this if your opponent has 3 or more poison counters. So turning your 1/1s into 3/2s is really, really good. It's reverse Pendelhaven. So this is like a modified corrupted Pendelhaven that taps for 5 colors of mana. That's just a B. I mean, on a land, that's really, really good. So I think as long as you have some 1/1s in your deck, like you're gonna be happy with the Seed Core, and it's gonna be excellent. And that wraps us up, folks. A lot of A's in this set, a lot of really good bombs. Now, notably, we gave out some pretty good B grades in the uncommons and commons because there is pretty good removal. So I'm hopeful that the removal keeps up with some of the bombs and we get some really great games. But, you know, 8 out of the 10 planeswalkers I gave like B plus, A minus levels, and then there was just crazy efficient threats that I gave, B plus and A minuses too. So there's a lot of good rares. But there's also a lot of good commons and uncommons too, and some really push cards in the set. So I'm super looking forward to the set. It actually just went live as of the recording today for the early access. So I know a lot of streamers and content creators were getting to actually draft it as we were making this video slash podcast. But to everyone out there who's listening via the podcast version or on YouTube, or if you happen to catch the stream bot after, just thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time anywhere you can catch 40 Card College.